the talk about what is justice.
No,
when
that's
he talks
no
about
joke. They
justice is
actually
speaking the
test
truth.
law.
Well, what happens when you borrow a gun from your
right, and then
friend?
you return
and
it
your
to him, you
friend
kill somebody,
goes
yeah.
mad,
You have a
right?
right to a rifle,
You
no matter how
return the gun
crazy
to
you
him.
are.
Especially how crazy.
Yeah. No, you can see it when you drive into Plaquemines Parish outside. This is the other parish right as you cross into the Ninth Ward, the really downtrodden Ninth Ward in New Orleans. You know, I mean, you know, advertisements, billboards, you know, with flashing lights around them. You know, next stop, next stoplight. You know, so and so's gun, you know, shop, whatever. You know?
It's like that in South Carolina.
South Carolina too. Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like walking.
Nikki Haley.
It's
Huh?
amazing. It's amazing.
Yeah, she's from South Carolina, Nikki Haley.
Well, my brother lives down there.
Yeah, right, right.
And he's
Yeah.
one of the gun nuts.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
You know, and they walk around, you know, the whole street. That's what they want to do. They want to be able to
I'll
come
tell
in-
you.
They want to come into New York City with the guns.
Yeah. So I had a Browning 3-shot automatic shotgun that I used to hunt with, and I kept it. I kept it at a family member's house. Unfortunately, the person who I kept at his house passed away last summer. Yeah. So anyway, I said, well, I want to donate something to the kid. Let's try to sell it. I said, I think it's worth some money because it's got beautiful inlay. You know, it's an old Browning, Belgium-made shotgun. So anyway, I asked Jeremy Glick because I know he's got some connections, right? You know, in terms of the possibility of finding out how much this is worth. I get it back. Oh, it's only worth $250, $300. They made so many this year. This is the expert opinion. So I'm thinking, oh man, I can only get $200 or $300 for it. I'm just going to tell my cousin, my younger cousin, just go ahead and sell it for whatever you can get. She calls me up. She gets $750 for it, 3 times the amount. Wow. Louisiana.
They appreciate the.
They want it. I mean, it's like, then this is what you're dealing with at a certain level. As it works, it's got some craftsmanship to it. It's got a aura, in a sense, right? etc. And it's going to yield you 2 times, 3 times the quote monetary value than you have on the East Coast, right? Yeah. It's a good hunting gun. I mean, no kickback. It's nice. No recoil on the shoulder. Yeah. Anyway, I remember I haven't used it since I was 15.
That's what they say about the AR-15s too, that they're relatively little.
Well, that's the
weapons, though. They
terrible
jam all
weapons.
the
They
time.
jam.
That's terrible.
Unfortunately, they didn't jam for this
That
guy.
would be enough.
Yeah.
I mean,
Didn't jam for this guy. Yeah.
Well, they
Unfortunately.
managed to solve the jamming problem.
They did. Okay.
Oh, they did?
Yeah.
That was more or less. Yeah, I mean, the M16s used to
That's
jam
right.
All the time. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
But they had to, they actually even built in a little side handle to kick it
Yeah.
Oh,
when it
really?
jams.
Okay. So, we're going to move from Freud back to Heidegger here now, since we've been on the phallus for a long time. Right. Okay, good. Time in the phallus, right? Anyway. All right. So I think the important part here, unless I want to go into the philosophy of history here. Are there questions? I mean, I did bring the Derrida, the note on the note, which is, very sophisticated, an interesting breakdown on substance in writing and presence in writing in Heidegger. And, Derrida makes a big to-do about that, Heidegger later will write the word sein, and he will do like a crossing through it like this. And, he does this in the being question. So for Derrida, this signifies that ultimately there's no such thing as full presencing, right, on Wesen, right? So this is interesting to keep in mind in terms of temporality.
Or unless it's a kind of God presence,
Yes,
only
yes.
God has presence.
Yeah.
And
Well-
if there's no God, there's no presence,
Right.
no
So
full
what is
presence.
there then? That's interesting. So if
Yeah.
there's no presence, then what? I mean, if
Well, I mean, the point really is, in a certain way, is that this becomes a kind of philosophy or a long discourse about absence
the void
and forgetting.
Absence,
Yes,
yeah.
absence and forgetting. This is really what it's about.
shifting of the
The
focus.
absent cause in Spinoza, the absent God, the God that absconds in the 20th century, right? Negative theology who takes this up as the negative aspect. I mean, this is the problem with atheism, as Kloskowski points out very well. Very good argument. Marquis de Sade, My Neighbor. This is a book worth reading. Anyway. Yeah, in which he makes the claim that the atheist presupposes that there once upon a time was a God, right? As a better term may have been anti-theist. It was always an anthropomorphic projection, right, in some ways.
Who is this?
Pierre Kloskowski, he was a Polish, he actually translated Being in Time from
Okay.
German to French, one of the early translators, and a great painter. You've seen some of his
Yeah.
drawings, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, good friends with Hans Belmer, related to Balthus. Yeah, you know.
Who's
yeah.
his brother,
Polish
right?
aristocracy, but
Oh,
Balthus
really?
was the brother.
Yeah.
Right.
They
Was he
both
Catholic?
made perverted paintings.
He's very perverted man. Oh,
No.
with a wife. Yeah,
His
of
are
course.
more, actually.
With a wife.
Balthus is like,
Right.
Balthus,
right.
is
oh,
like
it's
the
worse than
PC.
Balthus?
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Explicit.
Oh no, Kloskowski is no. He and Bataille walking hand in hand, holding hands at midnight in some ways, going down. Yeah. No, this was some generation. Yeah, I have Art and Text, the Australian journal, did a whole issue to Kloskowski's work. He wrote probably, in my opinion, the best book on eternal recurrence. I think it's better than
Right.
Heidegger's reading of the concept of eternal recurrence in Nietzsche, called on eternal recurrence. The Vicious Circle, Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle is the work. Yeah.
Was he a Catholic or?
Depends on what you mean
Lapsed,
by that.
lapsed.
Yeah. I mean, I guess he came out of that Polish, Catholic tradition. Yeah. Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle, I think, is the English title. Beautiful hand, very much like Hans Belmer. Yeah, very much like Belmer. Yeah.
Oh yeah, people love it right now. Actually.
Who's that? Kloskowski?
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh
Came
yeah,
back.
and
Came
that,
back
and
in a
that
big
stuff
way.
with his wife too. Those kind of chains on the.
I think
on
he
the-
made some films that got popular.
They made films of
Yeah.
the wife. Yeah.
Mhm,
kinda.
Yeah. People are really into that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Came back last couple of years.
Only the last couple, because it was very popular. Not very popular, but in certain circles that was
Yeah.
going around.
I like them. I think they're cool.
Yeah, no, I'm not arguing. Not hearing anything out of me. I mean,
Didn't he also write a great book on money? On
Yes, he did.
Which influenced everyone. Deleuze says it influenced them.
I think it
Right.
influenced Derrida's reading of Baudelaire, Counterfeit Money, which is a poem of Baudelaire's. Yeah. So very interesting there. Remember, look, this is the interesting thing about the history of philosophy if you get outside of this American approach. And, I mean, I'm not so sure this goes on in France as well. It's kind of just a different approach to philosophy. You have to read what's going on in the society at that time. So during Descartes' time, Descartes is asked to argue against the skeptics. One of the leading skeptics is a major counterfeiter in the 17th century, Chandos. Yeah, major counterfeiter. Right. The other one is a major figure who's considered a witch to the church, Father Urban, and which the you maybe have seen The Devils of London, the film, and Aldous Huxley wrote the novel. You know the novel about Father Urban? Yeah. He was a seductive, he was a seductive priest, basically. That's what he was, but he was considered a devil, right? Yeah. During this period. But I mean, the Devils of London. So there were these relationships. So the time with Kloskowski, right? I mean, they're really talking. This is during the war, right? During the war, in which you have all kinds of machinations going on in the art world. Counterfeit money, et cetera, inflation, all these things. So they're very interested in this, and very good book on that too. Wrote novels. Robert this evening, Robert ce soir, very, very good. He wrote another one on what is it? The Temptation of Saint Anthony, I think. It was another one of his. So yeah, he has this very, very rich background. Jameson told Stanley, this is what Stanley told me, I didn't hear this from Jameson, that said to him Kloskowski was the most intelligent figure of the 20th century. So, another one that's not written about or really thought about, in a lot of ways. But again, the translator of this, still, a kind of book that, gave this influence, yeah. But his artwork, I think he's got a great hand. I love his drawing. I mean, I like Belmer very much. I like what Picasso said. There's nobody, better with a drawing than Hans Belmer. But yeah, this is what Picasso said. Maybe there are other people, but at least, yeah, yeah. So anyway, yeah. No, he's worth looking into. So anyway, so his history, in a way, if you want to think of Nietzsche here too, think about Nietzsche's history in the use and the abuse of history, or the advantages and disadvantages of history. You have the monumental, the antiquarian, the monumental, and the critical. And Heidegger is sort of taking this on in some ways, right? In some ways. And remember here as well that, the question of the historical sciences, to go back to this, let me erase some of this. Right?
Uses and disadvantages of history for life. It's long.
The use and the abuse of history for life is one translation, but it's best the advantages and disadvantages of history for life.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the for life is interesting because you have a character named Wilhelm Dilthey. Right, and the question is that of the Geist and Wissenschaften. And this is where it gets interesting with Hegel. Thanks to Wissenschaften. This is where it becomes interesting with Hegel and Heidegger. Because Dilthey is the one who wants to put the so-called spiritual sciences, the Geist. Remember, it's the phenomenology of Geist, right? Back on the map. And what does this mean? This is being translated, and you'll see Heidegger use the word spirit, right? So you have spirit in time, spirit of the times, when you use a word such as zeitgeist. Some people use mind, the sciences of the mind. Some people use this as the spiritual sciences, right? The French translate this into the human sciences, right? So this is a discipline, right? In terms of reforming the academic disciplines during the late 19th century. And Dilthey is the crucial person, Wilhelm Dilthey, right? And you know that in sections, I'm going to give you at least the textual part on this. And we'll go through this. I mean, it's a very rich section, I think, and one worthy of reading and rereading. The page 377 is really begins with Dilthey, and then he goes into Dilthey and Count Yorick. So the end of section 76 and all of section 77, right? So this is where we're going to get section 76 and 77 on Dilthey and the Geist, Wissenschaften. Now, what's going on simultaneously, there's an outgrowth of the Napoleonic moment earlier in France, is what's called the Polizeiwissenschaften. And I know I've talked a little bit about this. In my view, the Polizeiwissenschaften basically takes over the disciplines. And this is where, Foucault begins to read discipline and punish disciplinary societies that ultimately, in Deleuze's vocabulary, become the societies of control. Postscript to the societies of control, which I still think William Burroughs' Naked Lunch is one of the great, fictional illustrations of it. You know, it's amazing that nobody's talking about that book amidst this so-called opioid crisis, as if this is just one moment of the opioid crisis.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
He
And
was
nobody's talking about the algebra of need, which was a great phrase of his.
Yeah.
But I'm
He
sorry,
was an
please.
exterminator.
Remember that wonderful, did you see the movie, the
movie
Cronenberg
was
film?
great, yeah.
Remember he knocks on the door and he's got on the hat? She opens it, got any bugs, lady? That's the opening of the Naked Lunch. But it's a scene from Exterminator, yes. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah. Very funny. Anyway, I'm sorry. So anyway, to go back to this, so you have this conflict now. And if you think about this, begin to think about this vis-a-vis people such as Goebbels, you know, who's not stupid. You know, you go back and read the propaganda. Those who control the street control the state. You know, you begin to look at that apparatus at work. Leni Riefenstahl, some of the people that are engaged during that time, right? There's a very, very active participation, right, in how will we use this, right? You know, to control this. And this becomes, you know, part and parcel of, you know, the revised ancient model of teaching, right? You know, the privileging of, quote, the Greco-Roman, but a very banal, reduced Greco-Roman. So you can maybe begin to see Heidegger
I see.
in 1930, you know, 1920s, beginning to bemoan, you know, this lack of, yeah,
I see.
understanding of the ancient world and the Greeks, right? Especially the Greeks in his case. I mean, he's Greek, he's not Latin, right? I mean, you know, in his background. And he begins to see that the Volk tradition, right, is not, and again, I'm not trying to, I'm just pointing to possible directions. Please don't hear me as making an apology for Heidegger, just possible directions of way he may be of constituting these things that are going on around him, right? That he takes the Volk and he's saying that you need a reorientation of this through the Greeks, right? That take on this kind of reductionistic approach to the Greek, you know, Latin world or to the Greco-Roman world, right? In some ways. Now, Derrida, you know, later, you know, in terms of the decolonization, I mean, I'm beginning to think of philosophy and history in a very different way, you know, personally. That Derrida, you know, in terms of the regimes of writing and, you know, the deconstruction of privileged concepts in the history of philosophy and the tensions that are operating, is basically trying to, you know, show not only this tension at work, but how it became completely wedded only to one, you know, moment in the history of philosophy, that is the Western tradition, right? And he's going to be trying to undo this, but he's showing how this journey takes place, right? How we're going to have to, you know, situate ourselves within it to mine it from within and explode it from within. This is what he's doing. If you want to think of this as guerrilla warfare, it's not a bad way of thinking of it. Heidegger has a war machine going. It's guerrilla tactics. There's no question about it in terms of the taking of the hyphens and these kind of engagements that he has with the language and the vocabulary. But Derrida sets the war machine up in a different way. That's constant guerrilla warfare by mining inside the concepts. The Abbau, again, you know, the Abbau, again, is a term of mining, too. To unbuild also means to unmind, right? So you're actually setting mind traps within the concepts that you're exploding from within, right? You're exploding these concepts from within. So this is the part of the deconstructive maneuver, right, in many ways. So when Arto sends out an email, I think he only sent it to me, about whiteness training.
Oh, yeah.
Leaving your white privilege.
Checking
Checking your white privilege. You know, the professor who's white has double privilege in the class. They're white and they also have the authority of being the professor. And you have to have sensitivity training about this kind of domination.
So
in
what's the
classroom.
point? What happens then after that?
He didn't go to the thing. Thank
You didn't get
goodness.
trained?
He hasn't gotten trained.
Uh-oh.
No, it's gonna, yeah.
That way.
You can see it on his file. Denied tenure. Damn, denied tenure. Did not come to
Yeah,
white.
then
My
Mr.
answer is
Train.
I'm not white. So. And of course, they can't say
That's a good
that I am
answer,
white because
yeah.
their liberal sensibilities. Like, no, I respect your.
Yeah, of
you know.
course.
You know,
Yeah,
identify.
yeah.
But my Haitian students don't consider me white, so that's all I need to hear. They said, "Professor, we're so
Oh yeah,
so
you get the
refreshing to have
knuckles
a-
in the hallway,
to have
man.
to have a man of color to teach, a young man of color to teach in this class."
Nice.
So we love it. So I love it.
You got to record
Nice,
it.
Arturo.
You carry that with you. Let me play you.
That's
a
a
Salvage
bad.
Get it in
article,
Yeah.
what is the first quote from Baldwin? To say you are white, if you think you're white, what is it?
No, I have it right here. I think it's if you think you're white, you're finished, something like that. But anyway, let me
Is
see
that
where
from
it
the
is.
price of the ticket? Or wasn't that his last collection of essays? The price of the ticket.
No, this is why but this is because of that film that Raoul Beck made. I'm Not Your Negro. As long as you think you're white, there's no hope for you.
That's
You
very.
just go hopeless.
Yeah.
You're hopeless.
That's
But
very
you're even
militant.
thinking about this at this point. That's what you should really respond to these people. But anyway, to go back to this, the undoing is always, I think, caught between these tensions. So what Heidegger is up to vis-a-vis the philosophy of history here is to try to confront Dilthey, right, about how the new historical sciences will work, right? How they will work. So his main antagonist here is the Diltheyan historicism, right? And we'll talk about that too, right? Gramsci would fit into an attack by Heidegger. Gramsci is a Diltheyan historicist. in
But
some ways.
Althusser is not, though, right?
And Althusser is not.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
No,
I'm
I also
listening.
criticized Gramsci
He does,
for being,
yeah,
is it
for being
coming
a
from-
historicist, yeah. Yeah,
Interesting.
well, it's coming from the Diltheyan tradition,
I see.
you know, yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah. So, again, if you remember, last week we were talking about, time and spirit. So if you turn, I'm just gonna jump around a little bit today, and we'll try to unify all this next week too. On page 411, Hegel's interpretation of the connection between time and spirit, right? And and we read this, remember, last week? So this is important vis-a-vis this quote, this word again, Geist as spirit, right? Right? Now, if you say Volkgeist, Volkgeist can also mean, Zeitgeist means the spirit of the times. How we're living in the spirit of. Say Volkgeist, you can actually be speaking a little bit to community. You begin to Gemeinschaften, right? And, where does this Gemeinschaften come from? So this becomes another thing. I mean, you probably know these people, right? Tonnes and others from the 19th century German political theorists, right?
Oh, yeah.
The difference
Yeah.
between society and community, right? And the
You can see
craft
how
of
the
each.
Nazis maybe didn't read those people carefully.
No, they didn't read it carefully, but they read this carefully.
But they read the other, yeah. Oh, yeah.
They read this carefully, and Napoleon made this very, very possible. The Napoleonic penal code
Yeah.
and the police state that is developed there is very, very effective.
There are some interesting German historians I was reading about, contemporary historians who study the camps. The the evolution of the German concentration camp, and they talk about sort of the influence of Napoleonic sort of inventions in that sense. Because the camp was supposed to be about labor, but like fixing the community through labor. Then they just added the death part later.
Right.
The death camp it was not originally part of it. But later.
Right. Okay, so let's go back here. So again, Heidegger is taking on the Kantian position on history as well, which was the cosmopolitan view. Kant is trying to think through a kind of liberal civil society that's unified, in, well, not at that time, but what we call the United Nations today, where people like Karatani goes, and even Stiegler in a different way in terms of their, politics of a global sense, right? They do go back to Kant, right, and this way. And Delphi, the philosophy of history is always connected to Lebensphilosophy, to life philosophy. So history is not divorced from life. So you no longer have history as a summation or a description of objective events and facts and this kind of thing, but it's always connected to life and life forces. This is what Delphi is doing, right? Now, going back again. No, I'm sorry about that. Let me just cut that off. Going back to this whole notion of time, you have to think of time as an ecstatic unity always in Heidegger. That you're, that's our Italian comrade. Anyway, to think of ecstatic unity, to always think it of is, ecstasis always has a direction. So if you're in the past, right, if your ecstasis is in the past, you have always a specific where to. So this connects somewhat with history and Heidegger. So, there's always, and I'm going to use the prepositions here, the where to marks the ecstasis, right? Right? And, so you're looking at the where, the in, you're always marking the where and where you are in the world, right? And let's talk about this a little bit. So with the Vorhanden and the Zoomhanden distinction, between the objectivity that he speaks of earlier, the things, present to hand versus ready to hand, the realm of utensils, right, is always positioned against the backgrounds of nature and worldliness of the world, if you remember this. So you can write a history, if you will, of these utensils. People that are very good at this, I'm going to try to riff on this and show, again, how one can use this and how people have used this to kind of do very good work. Friedrich Kittler is a very good example when you look at his book on film gramophone typewriter. He's another, German. He was at the Free University and very under talked about in the United States, Friedrich Kittler. So he's really doing this history of utensils. Also, mechanization takes control. Siegfried Gideon. Right? So you have a book called, this is a great book, by the way. I recommend this as, coffee table reading, have it on the coffee table and pick it up and peruse it all the time. Mechanization towards command, I think is the word, is the, I think, Siegfried Gideon. Right, and then the other one, his name is Friedrich Kittler. And gramophone film typewriter. So you begin to see ways of writing temporally the history of utensils, through this Heideggerian moment where world is always in the background, nature, and you're really writing the history of the realm of utensils, right, within that. Then you have this notion in the ecstasies. I'm doing this through time, so you can do past, present, and future, right, on the history of utensils, but always presupposing world behind this, right? And these two people are very good at both of this. I mean, there are other people, but, Richard Florida tries this nonsense with the creative class. He's such a lightweight when it comes to this stuff. He's another, a kind of liberal approach. Actually, Richard Sennett's book, The Craftsman, is kind of an interesting attempt at using a Heidegger. He doesn't say he's using Heidegger, but he does, and it's kind of interesting, in writing the history of craft through this. All right, so then you have the self, right, and the authentic self. The design is authentic self, as the one like many is the inauthentic, right? And then you have the public and the inauthentic together, right? This is also going on in time. So aren't we going through another inauthentic time with publicness around Russia, around, all the things that are being pushed aside in terms of the dominant media, and what people will talk about? Yeah, yeah. None of the real issues are being addressed, right? It's always directed from a, quote, momentary event, and what are we going to do about it that begins to narrativize the thing. This becomes inauthentic because it's, we're all in the boat together. It doesn't really separate out identity and difference, right, in some ways, and authenticity. And we'll talk more about that when we get into the authentic, So anyway, non-resoluteness is a term that Heidegger uses for the inauthentic. You're non-resolute, yeah. Okay, so in being, or, in again, and we've gone through this a little bit with temporality, attunement, the falling prey, right? The speech, and then the being of design is care, and the being of design is care has the who. This is the subjectivity. Foucault takes this what? The isness, the predicate, the in the world being, and being itself as all part of care. So care always has these 4 temporal moments. You ask the question, who is speaking and when, right? What is actually happening, maybe the event. What is the world in relations we're doing, the in. And then, of course, the being itself, right, that has been forgotten. So you begin to have the being of design as care. And this, for me, again, I want to keep saying, care, taking care of, concern, these moments to me are very significant for the left going forward. Unless we can come up with something like that, forget the left in the future, because, we're now living, especially in the United States, because we don't have that governmental, input. We don't, we're in such a corporate welfare state that we don't have really even a sense of what a care of the self would really look like going forward, because we're always fumbling for how are we going to get something more. For example, you take Social Security and you continue to work, you're taxed doubly on the Social Security you take, as well as the money taken out of your paycheck. You get doubly taxed as an elderly person, right? Yeah. I've never heard Bernie Sanders mention this once, or the cost of living. And this is the most, quote, progressive moment.
You mean that there are no cost of living increases in Social Security that are meaningful?
No talking about it at all as a real issue going forward, especially with a population that's aging at one level, right?
Well, Sanders did come out and say Social Security needs to be raised,
Yes, but it's not an ongoing discussion,
No, that's.
right? It's not in the public domain,
Yeah.
right?
No.
It's given, just like student debt. It's given, some coinage to, but they don't look at it. And then nobody's talking about student debt in terms of the raising of the interest rates now.
Oh, yeah.
Now student
Yeah, they're
debt,
going through
it's
the
going to
roof.
cost you more to salvage because now you pay more for.
Mine is 5.8% now, from 3.9.
Shit.
It went up
Went up.
already. What?
Well, it went up
1.9%?
last year, even. Unsubsidized loans.
Well, wait,
5.9%.
wait till you see the new. Wait till the curves start going up on the bond yields. You're going to be paying 8-9%.
That Bitcoin speculation on my mining operation better go faster than that.
Better get
So
some-
far it is, but
You better call Putin's
Better get some
cook.
more video
You're going to be
cards.
better off with Putin's cook than the mining operation.
No,
but
I'm
anyway,
mining
we
some
don't
obscure
really
coins.
have a politics of care. This is a real problem to my mind. To my mind, it's very, 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 very tragic in many ways. It's a welfare state for the corporations. It's not a corporate welfare state because the corporations hardly take care of their workers. It's not like Japan, right? From what I understand, right? That at least the corporations, you're at least taken care of for life if you work, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's changing a little bit.
It's changing, yes. Americanization is
Yes.
everywhere.
Yeah.
But
Everywhere.
yes.
Yes. Yeah. If Heidegger were alive today and he was in the room and we'd say, look, her Dr. Heidegger. You know, what would you choose between, at this point, the constant Americanization of the world, you know, etc., or, you know, an attempted, you know, socialism, or a socialism that, you know, has some kind of notion of care? He's going to go for the latter on any day of the week, right? He's not going to promote, you know, the Americanization of the world. He would hate this. He would hate this kind of thing.
She would call it the mediocrity of the average.
What is the mediocrity of the average? Yeah. No, there's no question about that. Yeah. But we need this care, and we need it temporally. We're not only in terms of the duration and the now time, but we need it as a, you know, working premise going forward. You know, again, the left has always been very good at the critique of the political economy. You know, or as the joke has it, we've predicted 16 of the last 4 stock market crashes.
The ratio always changes.
It went up. Rick was in demand 2 weeks ago. Now he's not in demand, right? Retrace 50%. You know, how do you explain that? You know, right, to your audience there. So anyway, just a thought about care. We can go back to that. So I want to look at the section here on authentic historicity. This is in page 377. I think this is a crucial passage for today. If you look at page 376, let's start page 376, the bottom of the page. And he's looking at the possibility of doing history, right? Of historiography, right? All right, and he has a long section on Nietzsche before this, right? Before where I'm going to read. I'm going to read from the bottom of the page. As historical, Dasein is possible only on the basis of temporality. Temporality temporalizes itself in the ecstatic horizontal unity of its raptures. All right? So this is what I was really trying to talk about. The 3 ecstasies, what I mentioned earlier, are always.
But that's a great dialectical sentence. The historical, I mean, Adorno should love this, right? Like, the great...
You're going to have a lot of convincing for that verb. Anyway,
The ecstatic,
maybe admire.
Yeah, the ecstatic horizontal unity of its raptures.
Right.
I mean, like,
Right.
how do you make sense of that? That's amazing. You know?
I'm
Because
feeling
it's also
really
the ecstatic.
lost.
It's the ecstatic unity. It's not just the unity. You know, it's the ecstatic.
Well, it finds
Horizontal.
time finds
Yeah.
itself, right? Time is to be found. Think of it this way: time is to be found inside the ecstatic horizontal unity of past, present, and future, right? In this rapture that is happening
Raptures
between
are past, present, and future.
together, all together. Okay, let's read on. But this is a very good section, I think, for our understanding. This end of section 76. Dasein exists as futural, authentically, in the resolute disclosure of a chosen possibility. So again, in your authenticity in terms of choosing the project, making the project in your thrownness, right? If it is done so in a resoluteness sense, in an authentic way, right? You exist, right? As a futural, authentic, being, if you will. The authentic determinations are authentic. Resolutely coming back to itself, it is open in repetition for the monumental possibilities of human existence. Again, the repetition of the future's past that we talked about too. The future antérieur is a linguistic, as a tense, right? The historiography arising from this historicity is monumental.
That's Nietzsche, right?
Yes, as
Yes,
having
Nietzsche.
been, Dasein is delivered over to its thrownness. You're delivered over to your thrownness, right? As having been. You're delivered over. Your past has delivered you over, right? In appropriating the possible in repetition, there is prefigured at the same time the possibility of reverently preserving the existence that has been there, in which the possibility taken up became manifest. As monumental, authentic historiography is thus antiquarian, another Nietzschean term. So the monumental to the antiquarian. Dasein temporalizes itself in the unity of future and the having been as the present. Right? The present, and this is important, as the moment discloses the today authentically. The present as the moment, as the moment, discloses the today authentically. But insofar as the today is interpreted on the basis of the futurely repetitive understanding of a possibility taken up from existence, authentic historiography ceases to make the today present. That is, it becomes, this is interesting, the painful way of detaching itself from the entangled publicness of the today. Okay? So the double is going on here. You're in the moment, right? At the present. You're seeing what's coming down, but at the same time, there's a simultaneous withdrawal, a painful withdrawal and disentanglement, right? Of the everyday. As authentic, monumental antiquarian historiography is necessarily a critique of the present, the third category of Nietzsche. Authentic historicity is the foundation of the possible unity of the three kinds of historiography. But the ground, and this is again very important, on which authentic historiography is founded, is temporally as the existential meaning of being of care. Okay? So you cannot have these three ecstasies without the ground of care, right?
Sure.
No rapture without the structure of care. No raptures. And the rapture, again, to what Chris was saying, the raptures are plural. There's a rapture from the past, the rapture from the present, and from the future.
What is he, why is he using the word rapture? I mean, I would think he meant rupture if you're using tenses. Why rapture?
I think there's a religious overtone here. It's hard to say, but I mean, I think it's also around the level of epiphanies, too, that you get in Joyce and, you get in the Catholic tradition, and especially that the Irish Catholic writers are very, very good at, deconstructing and speaking to. It's hard to say, but also rapture also means that you're kind of caught up. I mean, it is part of the ecstasies. You're out of yourself, right?
Yes.
I mean, you have to think of that too when I talked about the existence, right? Existence is being outstanding. You're standing outside of yourself. So that's another thing. When you stand outside of yourself, right? You're beginning to, see well beyond the enclosure, or just, as a, again, reason is not operative here. Again,
Yeah.
this is not a category of reason that
Okay.
he's dealing with, right? He's not dealing with reason here.
In
So,
resoluteness,
yeah.
you're also called, sort of, right?
Yes.
And so I think then in that
Werner
sense-
Herzog knew he wanted to be a filmmaker at
Right.
13,
So you're kind of,
and he was.
a rapture calls you in a way.
Yes, so you're outside of yourself. I understand it as the epiphanic or the ecstatic.
Yes,
To stand outside oneself is ecstatic.
yes, you're out of the stasis, you're out
Yes.
of, you're moving. It's a movement thing, too.
And
You
we
know, in
can
a
say
way.
maybe that alienation, being alienated, actually, the effect of alienation is it prevents this kind of.
Yeah, I mean, look, you have these
being
very good
outside of
terms,
oneself.
and this would be, again, interesting under a general thematic of why people don't act in their best interests and, et cetera, or in their own real interests. You see in Sartre where the stasis in motion becomes the practico inert. That you get to a point with these groups where they no longer can go any further. There's no more movement. So what happens is the motion becomes inert, right? The groups basically either dissolve or stay in the same pattern, talking about the same stuff with the same strategies, etc., right? So they become almost like a, psychic automism, right? In action, right? So I think he's playing off of this too. I mean, he's thinking this through too. Yeah. How does the group work? Okay. Yeah. So let's go
One
down.
other question.
Yeah,
Can
yeah,
we
sure.
think of thrownness as Nietzsche's fate?
I think you should think of fate more in terms of resoluteness and decisiveness.
Okay.
I think you should think of fate. You should think of fate, first of all, if you're going to think of Nietzsche in this context, amor fati, the love of fate. But I think in Heidegger, the first thing to remember is amor fatum, the love of the facts in the case, right? The love of your facticity, which is part of that care and the past, the present, and the futural ecstasies, right? And from there, you're thinking always, and remember, I know I keep repeating this, but it's important, possibility is always higher than the actuality. We are not stuck, according to Heidegger, right? We are stuck, unfortunately, in a lot of ways, but we are, according to Heidegger, no. The reason we're stuck, we don't think possibility. And we don't think temporally always in terms of possibility. One of the nice things, Che Guevara's great saying, let's be realistic, let's demand the impossible. Where possibility is always higher than actuality. Yeah. So these things have been, eliminated from our everyday quote experience or our everyday speech. Yeah. What would you say? Yeah.
Is the possibility then kind of occurs in the repetition? Is like that you can pull out?
Or is
Yeah,
it
of
in
course.
the difference?
I mean,
Repetition and
we
difference?
go back to, this is the 50th anniversary of May of '68 coming up in 3 months, right? There's going to be a lot of talk about this. How does one constitute May of '68? How does one go about doing, quote, a Heideggerian,
Right.
historiographic, or how do you do being and time and history, and looking at this? It's datable, right? It's a datability. It's related to clock time in some ways, but at the same time, it becomes part of an ereignus, a happening and an event. How do you constitute that event going forward?
Right.
Why haven't we, thought about, its, possibilities again? All power to the imagination. What's being stifled here, right? In a sense. Have we become so much under the form of the bureaucratic societies of controlled consumption and controlled behavior that we no longer have that possibility to imagine something possible? Are we victims of the Tina syndrome, which has been thrown out there? There is no alternative. See, in a way, that's the practical inert. The Tina syndrome, in many ways, is a good example of this stasis, in motion that feeds capital, and at the same time is totally anti-Heideggerian because it's only the actuality. You know how people say that's the way it is. Right? The vernacular. When once you begin to do a kind of catalog of the received opinions and the received proposition, that's the way it goes. That's the way it is.
It is what it is.
It is what it is. Well, that can be more profound, if you really think of the is and the is not, and try to work with that. But yes, I hear you. Yeah, the double predicates there. Yeah. Well, what is as Bob Dylan says. Well, what's yours? Well, what is? Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, try to think of it that way as well. That the possibility always is higher than the actuality. That means that the power, potentiality, all these things are much greater
That would be a great
than what you're seeing.
movement slogan, right, by
Yeah.
itself.
Yeah.
Imagination is
It's like
power.
Kant.
Imagine, yeah. It's
Being
the
is not a
possible
real
is higher than the
predicate.
actual.
Is not a real predicate. That the possibility is higher than the actual.
Imagination is power. That's
Yes.
a
All
slogan
power,
from,
all power to the imagination.
that's from the
Yeah,
68, I
that
think.
68 was one of the slogans. And then the guy on the horseback, the cowboy, and he goes, someone asked him, what are you into? He says, reification, man. Reification. And then he goes, that's cool. Yeah. into reification. Can you imagine? Into reification. Yeah. All right. So, I mean, you sort of, I mean, in some ways, the key here is the temporality in relation to history. Again, Nietzsche, the antiquarian, the monumental, and the critical. And the critical is where the movement really is in Nietzsche. The other two are not so much movement.
Not in the monumental?
Can be used for that.
Yeah.
Can be used for that. But critical is where the speed is and the alacrity.
Yeah. I don't know. The worst is the antiquarian, it seemed like, in Nietzsche. But in this, it takes a different measure in a way.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah. I mean, you need, what Heidegger's really saying is there's no such thing as a tabula rasa, right? There's no such thing as the quote clean slate completely, right? This is what he's really trying to say here. I mean, ultimately, we're going to talk futurally. Yes, we can talk futurally, and that's where the anticipation is, and he'll use words like this, etc. But, you're not talking about a full, erasure of the horizon. And this may be different. I mean, Nietzsche never said a tabula rasa, but he wanted to always go beyond and pushing those limits. And when you look at Nietzsche, that, on the ship, we're not shipwrecked. We're just setting sail for unknown seas, right? And there's a big difference. Nietzsche's, opening up in terms of a new horizon of thinking, completely new, whereas Heidegger may be. And this is where one could look at the Derridian notion of Heideggerian nostalgia versus the Nietzschean Übermensch, right? Look, if you want this in figures, in some ways, it's kind of interesting if you figure this. Say you're going to write a novel, right? So you have the Übermensch, right? The Owl of Minerva in Hegel, the wisdom. Right? So the Übermensch walks the day, but at the end of the day, it's the owl of the Minerva reason that is actually recapitulating the whole day under the watchful eye, right, of the owl, right? If you think about this, right? In some ways, right? And then you have, in a way, off to the path, you have the man of the forest thinking about wood paths, right? On the way back to, the pre-Socratic, to the islands, right? To pre-Socratic Greece, right? Right? So, you have this kind of figuration going on in the 20th century, right? The Übermensch, what is this overcoming of man, right? And the overcoming of the forces of the everyday. The Uber, what does this mean to transcend or go beyond? Right, in some ways. And then, but always is the Hegelian logic, Geist and spirit, is the logic on a trap, the Übermensch, right, with this carrying of the monumental, antiquarian monumental critical views of history, right? And, or does the future ecstasies, return us to a past, into our future, right? Do we catapult that way, right? So you have these moments. Back to the islands, to the uncharted seas, right? Or, are we still under complete surveillance by the cast, the long, cast of the of reason. Now Lukács plays the Owl of Minerva.
Yeah. Interesting.
Right? I mean, you want to think about this in terms of, if you want to be sort of somewhat creative, right, about, the Owl of Minerva becomes Marxist reason. Right, in the 20th century, right? That it's not reasonable what we're going through, alienation, the rates of exploitation, the pained existence, and all of these kind of things. Whereas the Übermensch itself is a throw of the die, right? Becomes the Mallarmé casting of the die, the contingency of a real rupture, right? Into something new and unknown. The new and unknown, right? The Heideggerian, and this may be where the Derridian, moment is. Now, Althusser liked to say about Derrida, he's the one who lives on the edge. He said that about him. Only one philosopher today lives on the edge. Right. So that's because Daddy Dog would bring him flowers every day, but anyway.
Oh, in the hospital?
You go to the hospital and bring him flowers, right, yeah. So anyway, and then you have, of course, Heidegger, who's trying to think this through, not through reason, but through temporal ecstasies, right? A whole new thinking about time, right? But unfortunately, the time, so he's logic is not enough. The Hegelian logic transferred into dialectical logic or Hegelian Marxist logic vis-a-vis Lukács, the Frankfurt School, and others is not enough, right? It's still within the logic, and he'll go through this in the section on history and in sections 82 and 83 of being in time. Not enough. So the signposts, the wood paths that he's seen, the signs of the future, is a kind of poetics, right, of anticipation, but it's still in a dialogue with the ancient Greeks. In Nietzsche's case, we don't get any such thing through the Übermensch. So, yeah. So this is a kind of return, if you will, critically through the antiquarian and the monumental,
I see.
right? And bringing it up. I mean, I'm simplifying a little bit, but I think for good reason. You know,
Yeah,
you can
it's
begin
helpful.
to see this in figural, kind of figural terms. You know, you can draw the owl of surveillance, of reason, Marxist reason. You know, you can do right,
The eagle,
and then the eagle, right? Yeah, yeah.
that's our animal.
Eagle.
Hegel.
Yeah,
Okay.
eagle in French. Eagle.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
So Nietzsche, in some ways, is the radical leap in a certain extreme sense.
In the extreme sense, the rupture, if you want to think of it that
Like
way,
the will to
and
power.
the true revolutionary force, if you will, in terms of all the thinking of the 19th century, is really Nietzsche, who's willing to roll the die into something completely different. However, one can say, there's a lot of historical research going on here, that this is an aristocratic radicalism and not anything that has to do with democracy or communism to come, right? It's about an aristocratic radicalism.
You know, there's
And
an
autostos in Greek, again, is the domination by the few, right? The very
You know,
few.
there's an uncomfortable thought here for the Marxist tradition, which is
Well, he has
maybe
to say
Plato
it
and
mild-
Aristotle.
Put it mildly.
maybe
here.
maybe Plato and Aristotle. If you go from there, maybe the demos, maybe the democratic impulse is indeed a I don't want to say a myth, but
Well, I'm not
It's
so
an
sure Marx
oversimplification.
himself always talked about democracy. I mean, the way we talk about it, it really never was a democratic moment. I mean, I think the struggle was much more. One phrase of Marx that seemed to be sticking out to me always in my readings of was the struggle for equality. Right? Now, whether that means democracy is another story. And what does that mean? What kind of democracy are we talking about? Certainly not representative democracy. Certainly about, non-participatory democracy, right? Voting democracy, all these things are could be left out completely. I mean, you can go back and maybe say, yeah, direct democracy that you saw, some people in the Marxist tradition, like the Council Communists, because they were about direct democracy. Gustav Landauer in the anarchist tradition, more about direct, democracy. Etc. But yes, it's a very disturbing thought, because what Nietzsche is really asking for is a community of, an aristocratic Geist, if you will. But Geist in this sense meaning community and spirit, yeah. Very much like, this Josiah Rice's interpretive communities of the 19th century. This was a group of people that would get together, that would have interpretive communities, that would set codes,
Who?
Codes. Josiah Royce,
don't
R-O-Y-C, you never read, okay, yeah, okay. Yeah,
Definitely not all power to the Soviets.
no.
But it's interesting that the Soviets failed precisely when the Civil War began. It was
Yes.
impossible
Yeah.
to wage a war with Soviets.
No, you
That's a
raise
real
it-
question
yeah.
that a lot of Marxists over.
Well, the question really is
Stalin
Heidegger.
too.
Heidegger
He says,
raised-
"Well, they just gave up on the Soviets. How are you going to fight a war? with the Soviets of 10,000 people arguing about the strategy.
No, Nietzsche was much more of a realist about war and human. I mean, you know,
And
in a way.
Heidegger,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Marx too, and Lenin
Yeah,
too, and
yeah.
all of these, and Mao.
Right.
All of these people,
Right.
Well,
right.
Mao did fight a war,
but without the Soviets, in
True.
a sense, right?
but I mean, the Long March was a
He
long
knew
war.
he knew about war. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
So maybe you're raising here the problematic of another thing that the left we have to do is maybe there are many lefts within the revolutionary tradition that are relational, that apply better or worse at certain situations in the junctures, you know, in the
No,
the
that's
curves
true.
of the
You
struggle.
could certainly begin to
You
do
know?
that.
There's
yeah.
not just one
Yeah.
mark.
I mean, look,
you know.
again, fundamentally, the question is, what do you struggle for? Right? Where is the struggle
Equality.
going?
Yeah.
Whether is there a direct object in this struggle, or is life itself just the struggle for quote unquote authenticity, for lack of a better term, or making what's one, you know, trans individuation, to use another term? Is that what it's really ultimately about at this point? I mean, is this, yeah, and it is the struggle for equality. I mean, what does the attack on whiteness really mean? I mean, it really means that you're in the moment of the struggle for real equality. And Marx's great saying, you know, how do we know if someone's more intelligent than someone else? And he replied, we won't know the answer to that question until we have full equality. And he's right. I mean, because what happens in this is class is left out, right? Class and class structure, you know. Yeah, in a way. Yeah. I mean, when you go to look at the complexities of someone's, you know, constitutive makeup, right, and how one is made in history, how one makes choices in history, and all this is extremely complicated. You can't just say, oh, because he went to this school or she went to that school, that they're smart and that's where they got all this. This is not the case. You know, you need relations, community, the friendships, what was the family
Aristotle's
dynamic, what was all of these
politics,
things go into this. And this has been a limitation, in my opinion, from psychoanalysis in some ways, that somehow it's too much about the family dynamic and the family neuroses. You know, I mean, not all
kind of a
people
bourgeois
that do that,
ideology.
but it's, you know, it doesn't really broaden out into these questions of existence, right? And the questions of how one stands out and how one's relationship to world and worlding happens, at least to my mind. You know, I think that becomes a limitation to the theory of drives, to the theory of, you know, triangulation, you know, all these kind of things that are going on in psychoanalysis. Even though they're very valuable to free people from neuroses, you know, etc. I'm not saying that it's invaluable the way it is. That's not the point. Just to strengthen it, make it greater than it, you know, and it is. Yeah. I mean, any thoughts about that? I mean, I just have, you know, thoughts. I mean, you know, yeah.
No, I agree. You know, Wilhelm Reich, you know, obviously did some of the pioneering work on that, especially with the sex pole writings and
Yes.
things like that. And, you know,
He was the original Red Sparrow, huh?
Right. The
Yeah.
anti-fascist attempts, but since then, well, I don't, you know, I don't really know a lot about Lacan. I would like to know more, but I think he seems to be the one who is making an opening for psychoanalysis in you know, in a more historical kind of. No, thanks.
Well, Lacan saw the social
The social.
as very prominent in
Right.
all of this in a certain way. Yeah, he brought the social into the clinic, right, so to speak. Right? And also understood this. I mean, the short session is based very much on Heideggerian temporality, that your anxiety is going to meet you in the future. So we don't have to have a 50-minute hour
Not enough
session
time.
all the time. You know, at 2 minutes, I know where your anxiety is and where it's going to be the highest. We cut, and we'll see, you know, how you handle this, right? Next session. And he thought that was much more therapeutic than sitting there droning on for 50 minutes. You're looking at me like, I saw that head kind of raising. Like, dear Dr. Lacan, you know.
I'm not in therapy, nor am I offering any.
There you go, okay. Yeah. Yeah.
But if you want a recommendation.
So you're saying that Lacan is saying, like, I am the future?
No, he says he's not he doesn't say I'm the future. He says that your discourse, and this is interesting going back to what I was talking about, care and temporality, that he is able to, as a listener, as the super listener with the, psychoanalyst should be, right? That he figures out, right, that you are at a certain point in your discourse, right, where the anxiety is the highest based on how he's, known. And he cuts the session there, whether it's a half an hour, 3 minutes, 8 minutes, whatever, right? And this is productive in the sense that that's where your anxiety is at its highest, right? And you have to encounter it. And, and he's marking your future this way, right? It's a very Heideggerian strategy. Yeah.
Attunement, no?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And he picks up on the attunement, what you fall and prey to, all of this, and he's understanding, in how this future will unfold, right? Yeah.
Did he ever?
That's for you to understand,
Did
right?
he ever acknowledge he could be wrong in terms of finding the exact moment where your anxiety is?
No,
the
but
highest
it's not a
and,
question. It's based on discourse, right? In a sense. So as you bring in your dreams. The analyst gives you back your fantasies, right? Right? Usually. I mean, this is really one model of the psychoanalytic encounter. Then secondly of all, you usually are speaking in certain repetitive patterns, right? That again, the super listener, the great ear, right? The big ear.
third ear.
Yeah, that was right. The Theodore Reik, right? It was the listening with the third ear, right? So anyway, in these contexts, yes, that the understanding is that you're marking, you're punctuating a discourse, right? Not yourself, and in that punctuation, whether it's full stop, dash, semicolon, comma, new paragraph, whatever, marks maybe in that discourse, where your anxiety is the greatest. So as being towards death, or and I told you the story, being towards death and death drive meet each other in the car with the two wives in the back seat. But anyway, he's able, supposedly, the task of the psychoanalyst is not to calm the patient, not to give tranquilizers, but in some ways to increase anxiety, to make you more capable of dealing with it. It's not about massage. It's not about, making me feel good, so to speak. Right?
Which should also increase one's openness to the anxiety of the world.
Yes, indeed.
Dealing with that.
Indeed. And the openness itself is like the open wound, right? In a certain way, that if you don't open the wound and you close it and you keep it closed too long, it's going to clot up on you, which ultimately leads to, in my opinion, the practico-inert or the stasis that, so many people,
So the
have.
commonly used stress reduction techniques.
Oh, this is nonsense. Yeah.
Are
Sensitivity
basically
training,
the
all this
opposite
kind
effect
of stuff. Yes.
of not confronting
Everything
the
going
anxiety.
on, the institutions, to my mind, are complete failures with all these kind of little interventions from sensitivity. The thing that you sent out to me is average for everydayness in terms of these institutions. Leave your white privilege at the door. What the
We
hell
can pick
does
it
that
up when
mean?
you leave the room.
Yeah. That's exactly the point.
Don't forget it.
Exactly the point. Don't leave home
It's
without your white privilege. Don't leave home without
It's
it.
inauthentic.
What's in your wallet?
Right? It's
Yeah,
inauthentic from Heidegger's point of
What's
view.
in your
Don't
wallet?
forget it and don't
Right,
pick
right.
up somebody else's
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, Dick. Who came up with this stuff? Somebody must think.
No, it's been coming up for a very long time.
Some think
tank must
This
have
has
come
been
up with
going
this.
on for a very long time, and this creates an
Yeah.
enormous amount of jobs.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
enormous amount. How to handle the classroom. I mean, I used to go to we'd have to go to teach the core seminar. You go to these sessions on how to teach. And I finally said, I don't need you to tell me how to teach the students. You know, I don't think you know the students. I told the person that was leading the seminar. You know, yeah.
So they don't say
I mean,
kill your privilege, check it.
First of all, they don't say examine it.
Yeah,
They don't say, you know, what made you get to this point,
Yeah.
you know, at this point? What choices did you make to get to this point, and how much do you still keep with you? And you'd ask the question, why should I give up the privilege?
Yeah, that's true.
That's a real question to people with privilege, right? I mean, when you really think you're going to tell
Class
the person,
suicide for no reason.
You're talking about your white privilege there, and the person with the white privilege is going to say, "What are the joker talking about?" You know, white privilege. You know what I mean. I mean, really, in all honesty, can you imagine going to Ivanka Trump and telling her, you know, you're a product of white privilege? I mean, you're not going to get nowhere.
She's
You're
gonna
not going
say
to
yes.
get anywhere. Yeah, she'll say yes, and I'm proud of it. Right. Right, in some ways. So really, in a sense, that whole notion itself. And what does that really do, that notion of white privilege towards the revolution in a certain way? You know, what does that mean in a certain way?
Class struggle, right? It starts with class.
Yes, but I mean,
Demotes
yes.
it, essentially.
Yes, but does it really affect any kind of real change? I mean, wouldn't it be much more effective to talk to people that have power and say this is more about the equality and the class struggle than
Well, that's the
saying,
point, yeah.
oh yeah, the white privilege is operating here?
Right.
I mean, is that going to go over in a court with a jury? You know what I mean? Yeah.
Mhm.
It's probably an all-white jury to start with.
12 Angry Men.
Yes.
Very good film, by the way,
well,
on this very thing. I mean, privilege, right? And yeah.
But this also feeds the alt-right and the, you know.
Well, of course,
What's-
again,
you know, that's-
you start doing this and you keep doing this. I still think that, and the book has not been written, but there should be a book written on this kind of jargon and how it's contributed to the settlement and the empowerment and the continuation of empowerment for the alternative right or for the right itself. How this has worked, the PC. I go to New Orleans. I sit down with a group. You know, we used to have coffee. A group of people, all types, cast of characters, all political stripes. Sit down. You'd hear the lawyers sitting there. Man, what's this stuff? All these people taking over departments with all this political correctness. This isn't thinking. And in a way, they're right. You know, in a way, they're right. Even though they're coming from a wrong position, wrong political position about it. You know, who's going to tell people how to think? You know, to their mind, this is a form of, you know, not real change or thoughtfulness, you know, etc. Yeah. So, I mean, Baldwin's talking about culture. He's not talking about just privilege here. I think, you know, I think
He's
really
talking about
culture.
whiteness, and there's
Yes, as a
the alt-right in its most violent
right.
phenomena is a violence to keep this country white. And you can see that Trump is doing the same thing with immigration in trying to privilege white countries in their the immigration policy of this country. So the alt-right is really trying to put power and whiteness together and keep them together.
But you know, in a real sense, I mean, this sounds off, but it is a white country.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
But
I mean,
in time, it's not going to be.
It's a recontextualization of the Roman legal system.
Give it 30 years.
Right? It's formed
Give
by
it
an
30
English
years.
elite.
It won't
right?
be a white country.
But
What do you
then-
mean,
Well, you mean
demographic?
by,
No, but
yeah, but you
demographically.
mean by
Yeah.
the
Ideologically.
Constitution.
Demographically, yeah.
Yeah,
Of
ideologically, it's a white
yeah.
country,
Ideologically.
and also in terms
How's
of the
that gonna
population.
change?
Demographically, it's already not a white
Right.
country.
Most
Right.
I hate to
But
say this,
But
Logically, it is,
ideologically and
of course.
politically, it's a
Yeah.
white
most
country.
of
We're
the
still
most
living
of
by
the
the
black
same rules.
culture
Yeah.
that emerged after the 70s is a wannabe white culture.
Yeah.
They like everything that the whites had. It's really about drive for bourgeoisiedom.
I mean,
Yeah.
somebody could
Bougie.
say, if you look at the
It's problematic to me. I mean, you know, I'm horrified by this.
and if the
people I
alt right
talk to,
if
yeah.
the alt right rides the trains today, they're going to say America's a third world country.
Right.
Well,
It's
that's
Bangladeshi
also true.
people and like all these random cultural mixings that produce no. I mean, this is what the right wing is saying. Like and we have to take this seriously. Like despite its racism and sort of, but
Yeah.
what is that immigration flow from East Asia with the conservative Islam bringing to America that's worth respecting? I mean, this is the right argument.
Yes, but.
Why should I, I mean, and I thought about this, like on the train, like this is what the right is saying.
Were you sitting next to Bangladesh?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe that's why the trains don't work anymore.
And nobody speaks. No, but it's an interesting phenomenon. Nobody speaks the same language, and I'm paraphrasing like what this sort of educated right-wing person would say. Nobody speaks the same language on this train. Everybody couldn't care less about the larger political community that they're in, right? So what's the point of these people coming here? Right? I mean,
So maybe
that's
we
the
should
real
be
power
like
of the.
Iceland, where everybody has, where everybody, the telephone books are about that thick because everybody is named Johansson.
No, but what I'm saying is.
Oh, it's like South Korea.
Yeah.
Oh, you know Mr. Park? Yeah, I know Miss Park. She's
Well,
down the block.
but I'm
Mr.
saying,
Kim.
No, but what I'm
should
saying is the right-
Does homogeneity always spell it out in our favor?
No, but I
Isn't
think-
diversity make us stronger
But this is the
too?
argument against the liberals that the
Yes,
right wing
but-
is saying. They're saying, look, yes, previous American iterations, you had the forced immigration by black people from West Africa through slavery. Okay, then you have all these Italians, the Irish, whatever.
Who were not
the Poles.
considered white.
Yes, but through
Who
time.
were not considered
Yes,
white.
but within, but those people. I mean, this. I'm just paraphrasing the right wing argument, which I feel the left is not doing a good job at confronting. And they're saying, what is the integration possibilities of these contemporary multicultural liberal ideologies? What is the integration that needs to happen in order to have a functional, right, capitalist state?
For
you
the
know?
Italians and the Poles and the rest of them, they bought into whiteness by accepting
There you go.
capitalism.
What about these people? They can't buy the whiteness, right? So that's the problem. So how are they going to be integrated?
Why not? The Italians were not considered white.
They're
Now
not
they're
considered
white.
white, but they came from the lands of the Roman Empire. I mean, there are these narratives that were made,
Yeah,
you
the
know?
point is, there's not room for everybody to be
Exactly.
white.
Exactly.
Right.
There's not enough room for
Well,
people to
I
be
mean,
white.
Because we need another, basically.
Exactly.
Right.
And, if you make some.
So
You
what's the
can't
left
keep
answer to that?
the system going without that other,
Exactly.
too. That's another thing. You need those oppositions to think.
And the
that-
liberal
That
answer is no, we
assumes
just
we
want
wanna
everybody.
keep
But of
the
course, they don't
system
mean that
going.
either.
Yes, of course. I mean, I understand that. Yes, but then the question is, what are you going to replace it with? That's another question.
That's the
Right?
question. I
The
mean,
question.
You know.
You know, you have to
Communism.
theorize this. Yes, but what kind? And how do you theorize that? Where's the
No
destruction? Where is that going in terms of the simultaneous reconstruction in a certain way?
Because
the problem is we only have these attacks all the time that are going on, right? We don't have really the reconstructive moment.
Attacks by whom?
the left.
The left.
against
The left is
the
always
critical
good at
yeah.
attacks
The
on
criticism.
what's happening. I'm not saying
But
it's
what's
a
the
bad
positive
thing
program?
to have the critical,
You know?
but the question is, what is the positive program? What are you selling, to put it in capitalist terms, what do you sell as the good or the good life out there? That we're all going to share bread at 6 o'clock every day and drink wine? I mean, what are we really
Works for
saying?
me.
Not for you. Good. See, this is a
But you're
real
right,
question.
there is no answer.
This is a real
There is no
question.
answer to
What
that.
is the positive program? And this is something that the right and the neoliberal state has been so good at. Nobody used to sit around and worry about where you're going to go eat. You just go get a stupid burger at the local joint in 1970 or 1968, et cetera. Today, everything's about the food, right? We're all gourmets. We're gourmands, right?
Yeah,
Right,
but
right, right,
it's
right. I'm just
always a
saying.
group that says, I got here, I'm now considered white, slamming the door on the next group that wants to come in because we need another.
But the right is saying there's an integration process
Yes,
here. You
right.
become one.
They
you
do.
become you don't create more you know what I mean? Like racism creates segregation, but multiculturalism creates another type of ghettoization where everybody has their mosque, their
Right.
community center,
That's right.
and they're saying you can't function like that as a society if you're
But
that
we always
ghettoized.
have. We've had Italian neighborhoods and Irish neighborhoods.
anymore.
Well, I mean, I think
Well,
they
but we did.
misunderstand what white is.
Now other people have taken over where the Jews lived, the Italians moved in, and one of the reasons why New York City is so successful in terms of race relations is the diversity. Other cities where blacks and whites have been much more violently separated, whereas there's more of a mixture in New York. Think about it in Chicago or in other cities where
I think
white
there's
flight has happened more.
Massive segregation in New York City.
Well,
Massive.
especially now with talking about the trains, the F trains full of white people, rush hour, like really wealthy ones. I mean, I don't see. I mean, the A2 now. It's happening to all the trains actually. So where are all the black people?
Well, and also we have some of the most segregated suburbs.
Totally.
Of,
Apparently,
fact-
Cobble Hill is the French neighborhood. This is what French
In fact,
person
you can
told
also
me.
notice, like in my neighborhood in Jamaica, the racism is by,
Yeah.
if you hear racist like speech on the bus station, it's more often by like the local, like the immigrant communities, like the Bangladesh community, against black people. The black
Yeah.
people are again the target of even by
Yeah.
the newcomers
The
Of
who are
course.
not white.
Afro-Caribbeans and the
You know?
Afro-Americans.
It's
Look
like
at that
you're a
struggle.
conservative Muslim.
Yeah.
You're definitely not like American for the right wing.
Look at the
But
struggle.
you are still internalizing their racism.
Sure, every group has. That's the other.
Don't worry, Cyril Ramaphosa will.
Yeah, but again, going back to,
liberate
you need the positive program.
We don't have it.
That you have to start thinking about this. This is why, say, a conference at Birkbeck in 2009 was a beginning. It's not being continued, unfortunately, during Trump, because everybody's fixated how we're going to get rid of this and what's this awful thing. But it began. The idea of communism, the question of, and also the hypothesis. Well, how do you take that further in a certain way? I mean, look, the tools are here to always talk about possibility higher than actuality. It's not that we lack the, quote, imagination. What's lacking is the transformation of that imagination into a program, and you don't necessarily always need capital. Look at what the left, how long has the left been looking at real estate in New York for the last 40 years? And the best we come up with is the commons, which is, in a sense, which is basically a proprietorship, not anything to do with the notion of commons, right, in a sense? Or Mayday, Woodbine Collective, the base, these little places, these little isolated places here and there. I mean, why hasn't, the imagination gotten to the point of where, listen, in the 50s, the Communist Party people, who were basically Stalinists, they understood. You better make some damn money and get yourself a place to congregate,
That's right.
to
They're still
dance,
on 23rd
to meet
Street.
people, dance, meet people, etc.
That's right.
They used to close clubs because Jews and blacks started sleeping with each other. They're threatened by this kind of stuff. So real estate becomes a very important element in all of this. Keeping segregation. I mean, I'll disagree. I don't think the neighborhoods of New York are that integrated. I don't really think that, I mean, look, we have better relations in a way where it's not, you're seeing, police and riots going out and people rounded up every second. But on another level, I mean, this country is still incredibly racist. And
Oh, yeah. Oh, who's
and
not?
all the division.
God, I'm not saying that.
No, I know. Yeah.
Not saying that at all.
I mean, the Chinese and the Italians. Look at Abel Ferrara's early movie, China Doll. It's about a crossing of the line into Chinatown from Little Italy. Just right there, you see it in the neighborhood and the clashes. Right? We say in Fort Greene, lock your doors. It's a white neighborhood. This is the joke. Since all the white people moved in, we say. I mean, seriously. No, we do. I mean, in a sense. So yeah, I mean, I think this is important. I think New York is very homogenous right now. This
Very.
is part of the
Disneyland.
problem. Yeah, part of the problem.
It's terrible.
Yeah.
They don't even, people don't look
We
where
gotta
they're
go.
walking.
I'll be in touch. Yeah. We're
We
gonna
have to
do a
go to
little
this
more
gourmet
on this
restaurant thing.
Gourmet.
I mean, I'm going to a restaurant that's
It's
organic.
gourmet. Which one?
It's called Narcissista.
Oh, boy.
Rachel, you know it, or you just
No,
responding
the
to
name.
that?
Responding to the name.
8th Street. You can't make this
8th
up.
Street
no,
and
no, no,
really-
it's Narcista. Narcista. It's like a
Narcissista.
made-up word.
Yep.
Narcissista.
It's farm
Ask them
sourced,
this-
locally sourced farm.
Ask them if this is for a new movement, like Sandinista or, Communista.
It's the people
Or-
who grow vegetables in their gardens on the roof of their apartments.
I see. And who is this, from BMCC people or
No,
your
it's
wife's
just Bree,
friends?
yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's just Google, the algorithm.
I got you.
Even worse.
Oh, God. Okay, well, enjoy yourself. We'll see you next time. Yeah.
I will ask them
Okay.
about the Sandinista.
Yeah, good. Yeah, absolutely.
And narcissist
Okay.
is, right?
Yeah.
So the left
Yeah, go
having
ahead.
real estate, in a sense, would be the monumental in Nietzschean terms, right?
Well, if you want to start translating it that way, I mean, look, the problem has always been, Bakhtin knew this very well in his writings in the dialogical imagination. Unless you have meeting houses and it's a regular thing, you're never going to produce a movement. You can't do a movement by social media only. You cannot do a movement by events like the Left Forum once a year or conferences here or there. You can try to build in study groups and in collaborative, seminars and stuff like that, but very, very difficult without a general meeting place, in a certain way. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
And the monuments, this meeting place outlives the community in some sense.
Well,
or
yeah, I
continues
mean,
to
the old
communicate.
social clubs in the Bronx were places where a lot of subversion took place.
Exactly.
They closed the social clubs. They used to burn them. You know about this. They burned some of the social clubs over the days, right?
Yeah.
But
You know?
the
We don't have
right,
movies like what was the name of the Saul Urich term, The Warriors. We don't have films like this anymore because we don't have communities like this, right?
the
Think about
right,
it.
the right
Yeah,
has also obviated some of the real estate problem because the alt-right is an online community. They grew up online.
That's an interesting point.
Yeah, in some ways.
They don't have space either.
But they have gun clubs. And
See, Peter's not
Because
so
the
far
range.
off about the Chelsea Glen Club from the
Yeah.
left.
What?
Peter Bratsis is not so far off having the Chelsea Gun Club. Yeah,
It's interesting.
yeah. Yeah, to a degree, though, that way, but you have to remember, they have tremendous support, too. That's something that is non-threatening, to quote the state and state terrorism.
No, of course not.
Right, so that's, in some
But they
ways
also
tolerable.
are the greatest source of domestic terrorism.
They don't care about domestic terrorism, Chris. When did they care about domestic terrorism? No, honestly, when you think about this, domestic terrorism was never on the agenda of either the FBI or the CIA, right? Terrorism everywhere else, right?
Okay.
Yeah. If it was foreign terrorism coming in, well, wait till you see the terrorism in the news about the 13 Russians over the next 2-3 weeks.
Oh, yeah. We're
How
gonna
this
be
is the
hearing
new
it.
enemy. We're entering the new Cold War because of Putin's cook.
The old Russians?
Cooking it, the old Russians. That's right. Right.
Yeah.
And how many movies have we had about this, about the oligarchs, the possession of nuclear weapons? They're behind this, that, and that. How long has Hollywood prepared us for this moment? And like I said, March is the release of Jennifer Lawrence's new film. She should have known better with her new boyfriend, but anyway, he should have convinced her. But anyway, because he's halfway smart. But Red Sparrow, right? She's
It's the same as like Atomic Blonde, it's the same thing.
Atomic Blonde.
Yeah.
Scarlett Johansson, right? Wasn't it?
Yeah,
I
it
didn't
was
watch
it was a movie
Sounds
about
ridiculous.
this woman who's a spy with the
Right.
Russians, and that was last year's Red Sparrow. But it's like every so often, a new they've got to have a Cold War, otherwise they can't control. I mean, that's their. They've got to have a boogeyman, in order to control people.
The
But the
arms race.
bogeyman is not coming from the people that are currently occupying the White House.
No.
Speaking of whiteness.
No, it's coming from the same people that set it up before. the the Dulles brothers would be proud of. Although they think they're a little crude.
The Dulleses are crude, or the people today are crude?
The people today are.
Yes. The Dulleses were gentlemen.
Yeah.
Yeah, killer is gentlemen.
Killer gentleman.
Killer gentlemen. Yeah, the club. Sorry. Well, let's go back to this section just for a little while. I'm sorry that we're kind of but a lot happened this week.
Actually, before we get back, I have
Yes,
a question. What is the deal with this Black Panther movie? Does anyone know? Speaking
I
of
don't
government
know.
funded
It's like
movies.
a comic book, but
I know, but no one is angry about this. I mean, what is that?
Report.
Rachel,
They want me.
Are
Were
they?
there?
Did
Oh,
they say
yeah.
something?
Okay.
They
Because
what?
this is so ridiculous.
Who wrote
That-
it?
It
Black
must have
Agenda
been.
Report.
oh yeah, of
It
course.
must have been government
Glenn
funded,
and our friend
right?
Raymond. I'm gonna give Raymond the shirt he wants so bad. Rachel's favorite shirt too.
Oh, I like that shirt.
Oh, I like that
You like
shirt.
that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like.
I mean, that
guy,
must be
so.
the government that gave the black director money for the black, all the black crew, cast to like call it Black Panther.
The Panthers were a real threat.
It's like, I cannot get over it. I cannot.
You want to read a good account?
Ugh.
Read Showdown at Desire. I was there. Showdown at Desire, 1970. The Black Panthers, actually fighting the police.
Yeah.
Showdown, guns, both sides from the project. The way I know it, my family was in the food business, and one of their people were the supermarkets. Was they financed the local Afro-American guy. His name was Foreman. And he had the major supermarket in the Desire Street housing projects, one of the roughest housing projects in New Orleans. And the Panthers were very much there. And they had a shootout with the police. And then a book was written called Showdown on Desire. I have a copy of it, yeah.
Yeah, but
and Streetcar Named Desire, Tennessee Williams. That's
Right.
what Desire Street is, and it went into this area.
I mean,
So,
I think it must be the Democratic Party funding this film.
I'm sure of that.
I mean,
There's
like, or
also
the UPS guy comes
Ta-Nehisi
in.
Coates and the
I mean, it's
the
crazy.
comics. It's out.
Yeah.
The Black Panther comics.
I know, it's crazy.
This is all part of a political economy.
Crazy.
It's
But black
always
people are
good to
so
read this.
excited. They're going like this because of a stupid comic movie.
Well, Beyonce set it up.
I
The black leather, remember, and the black power salutes at the
It's
Super
insane.
Bowl.
It's
It's
trying to
rewriting of
eradicate
history.
history.
Exactly.
But
It's a
interesting,
rewriting
yes.
of history.
And this is interesting vis-a-vis
Yeah.
this
Yes.
lesson
That's
of
exactly
how
what it
the
is.
now time
Yeah.
Yes.
takes over. The here and now,
Yeah.
the erasure of memory.
Yeah.
In the
Yeah.
Nietzschean sense,
Yeah.
the complete erasure of all three aspects, the antiquarian,
Yeah.
the monumental, or where the monumental only becomes image in the present,
Totally.
which is no thinking,
Yeah.
etc. The digitalization of everyday life, like in a Stiglerian sense, is a very good example of this. What's really coming down. Yeah.
It's like atemporalizations. No?
Yeah.
Like it doesn't
Yes.
have any
It's
sense of temporality.
ahistorical and
Yeah.
atemporalized,
Yeah.
right?
It's very
It's
static.
atemporalized because it's static and
Yeah.
it just is going to entertain. And we're already dealing with a public that is already a stasis in motion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
If you're dealing with a practical inert all the time in a stasis in motion, you can feed it anything. You can feed it anything. And this will be fed. And this generation, I'll tell you, I
Oh, it's
teach and I
bad.
teach here. And I come
bad.
into the classroom and, listen, I got to ask the question, what the hell has been going on in these high schools? These kids don't know anything. They don't know anything about history. They have absolutely not even a sense of history, much less any knowledge of history. It's frightening to the level. And then supposedly the students' SAT scores are highly increased here at LIU. And I'm going to myself, oh my God, this is,
I had a student who thought that Martin Luther King fought in the Civil War.
He did. The
Which
second
one?
And she wasn't the only one.
That's what you should have said, Chris. You're right. But there was a first one, right? It's in the history books. Yeah. Yeah. Fought in the Civil War, huh?
At least he had a sense he was.
At least he
fighting for
didn't say it
justice.
came from Germany.
Right.
Well, that would have been clever.
Yes,
At
that is.
least,
That's
at
true.
least,
That's true.
yeah.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, it's very frightening. I mean, and this aspect of how the media, how daily intake of news, right? Even the New York Times, it's like reading a surrealist puzzle. Once you put it together, you figure out the temporality, the use of the words. I mean, it's worth studying this stuff because, again, it's what's coming down to 98% of what Marx would call the general intellect, which is non-intellect right now, Yeah. That's another thing that's interesting about this. You could actually transpose this to the Grundrisse, the fragment on machines and the general intellect, and start talking about temporality this way too, in the Marxist sense. So this becomes an interesting synthesis, if you will, or a kind of parallel move you can make with Heidegger to the Grundrisse and the general intellect, right? Vis-a-vis how one goes back and rethinks the Geist and Wissenschaften, for today, the human sciences. Because really this is a way of how do we do history. And you remember Hayden White, probably. Who? Hayden White. You didn't read meta history? Okay, well, Hayden White was a person at the University of... Bob, did you know Hayden White, the meta history, the book?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Hayden White tried to talk about history beyond, and tried to take some of Heidegger into account here, too. So this was a way of looking well beyond the normative way of doing history through dates, events, people, places, this kind of thing, what bill was signed. So, he is on to something here. In a different way. I mean, it's a very different way of how does one write history? How does one, do history, right? Yeah. And you have the great historical schools, as you know, right, in France especially, the Annales School, Ferdinand Braudel, which is, beautiful, Marc Bloch, Jacques Legoff,
I know
George
Braudel.
Dubuis.
I have the volumes of the
All three?
Mediterranean.
You have all three? Yeah, they're all good. Yeah.
So Heidegger is saying that we write history in this sense, almost aesthetically, right, through the antiquarian.
Well, he's
without-
recapitulating Nietzsche here. Now he's going to go on to talk about Dilthey, right? So if you go back to 377, I know a few people, the existential and historical origin of historiography may be presented concretely by analyzing the thematization that constitutes this science. Right? Historiographical thematization centers on developing the hermeneutical situation that is opened up. And the hermeneutical situation is always tied to the three temporal ecstasies. Right? Okay? One historically existing design has made its resolution to the disclosure and repetition of what has been there. You've made your decisive moment to cut into that moment, right? Into that moment of what has been, right? The possibility and the structure of historiographical truth are to be set forth by in terms of the authentic disclosedness of historical existence. So this is an attack. I mean, she's in the bathroom now, but you can see the whiteness under fire right here, right? How do you disclose this? What do you do for it, etc.? So instead of Eric Foner giving you the books on Reconstruction, it's really Du Bois who has the book. Black Reconstruction is so much better than... Did you ever take a course with Tim Skimmerhorn at the old Brecht? He's very good. Did you know him, or he was an MTA...
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
I took Du Bois.
Yeah, exactly. Black Reconstruction. He's excellent on this. He's a really great guy. He's recovering right now, and yeah.
He's
But
a
anyway.
train driver for the MTA.
Yes, he worked for the M. He's part of the Democratic, yeah.
Well, when I was in his class, he was still driving trains.
Yes, he was an MTA driver. Yeah, there we go.
And he did that on purpose. He had a college degree.
Yes.
He got out of college. He went to work for the MTA so he could join the union and become a union educator.
That's correct.
He did all his life.
That's right. Great guy,
Incredible story.
Tim. Yeah. I'm trying to get him to come to the Left Forum because they're going to do Du Bois. They've been doing. They did Paine. They did Marx. They did Gramsci. They want to do Du Bois this year, and yeah.
Well, he's really good on Black Creek.
Yes, he really knows that stuff. Yeah. Tim Skimmerhorn. Well, I'll try to get him to teach again. He's been very sick. He had a bout with cancer, but he's okay now. He started to get into recovery, and hopefully he would want to teach something. We'll see where his energy is. Yeah. Anyway, but again, the authentic disclosure, we're talking about whiteness, and Heidegger, on page 377, how, to be set forth in terms of the authentic disclosiveness of historical existence. But since the fundamental concepts of the historiographical sciences, whether they pertain to the objects of the science or to the way they are treated, are concepts of existence, the theory of the human science presupposes a thematic and existential interpretation of the historicity of Dasein. Such an interpretation is the constant goal that Dilthey's investigations attempt to approach, and then illuminated most penetratingly by those of Kant, York, von Wattenberg. It's a smart guy. I know he's not read. There are not many dissertations written
Count
on
York,
Count
I knew
York.
him well.
He was friends with Madame Sosostris, famous clairvoyante, right?
Sosostris,
the
yes.
Count with that Sosostris, right? The goddess of Egypt, who became the clairvoyante in the 19th
Bard
century.
she came on.
Yes, right. Famous clairvoyante. right. So, anyway, so he's going to begin to problematize. So, Josh, this is Heidegger at his best again,
Yeah.
just anticipating Dilthey's thing vis-a-vis Nietzsche, right, and where the historiographical sciences are.
Yeah.
So we're preparatory here. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. The confrontation with the problem of history grew out of an appropriation of Dilthey's work. It was corroborated and at the same time strengthened by Kant York von Wattenberg's thesis that are scattered throughout the letters to Dilthey. The image of Dilthey still prevalent today is that of the sensitive interpreter of the history of the spirit, especially the history of literature, who also concerned himself with the distinction between the natural and the human sciences, attributing a distinctive role to the history of those sciences and also to psychology, then letting the whole merge into a relativistic, Lebensphilosophie. So you have this attempt, right, in which the Germans were seeing, again, this totalizing moment of you would take the natural sciences, the human sciences, bring them together, add psychology, and you would have Lebensphilosophie, life philosophy, or the philosophy of life, right? For a superficial consideration, this sketch is correct, but it misses the substance. It covers over more than it reveals. And this is Heidegger, again, disclosure, covering over versus the revealing or the unconcealedness. Dilthey's investigation can be schematic, and this is important. I know people don't read Dilthey if you're outside of, obviously they're not reading in sociology and psychology, but we had to read Dilthey, and Dilthey's a very important thinker. He's a very important thinker to Tony Negri, by the way, who wrote a dissertation on Dilthey's concept of historicism, right? Very, very interesting work by Negri. Yeah, I think it's going to be translated soon because Negri, wants more of his earlier stuff out there, and he's getting up there. He's about 80, 86 now, 85. 86. Okay, so anyway, Dilthey's investigations can be divided schematically into three areas. Okay, so we have the scheme here. Studies regarding the theories of the human sciences, and what I put up, the Geisteswissenschaften, the distinction between these and the natural sciences. So you have the, Wissenschaften Natura along that as one schematic, right? Then the investigations into the histories of the sciences of human being, society, and the state, and the endeavors towards a psychology in which the whole fact of being human is to be presented. Now you remember, you can read this alongside, again, and analogously to what we did earlier in this, term or whatever, back when we were looking at Heidegger critique of the disciplines, the foundational and the fundamental ontology. Remember, we were doing this and we were talking about psychology and the biological science. So Heidegger is actually taking this into account early in his treatise, but now talking about this vis-a-vis historicity. Yeah, okay? All right. So, investigations in scientific theory, the history of science, the hermeneutical psychology constantly interpenetrate and overlap each other. When one direction predominates, the others are motives and means. what appears to be disunity and uncertain chance attempts is an elemental restlessness of which one goal is to understand life philosophically and to secure for this understanding a hermeneutical foundation in terms of life itself. Right? Everything is centered in the psychology that is supposed to understand life in the historical context of its development and its effects as the way in which human being is as the possible object of the human sciences, and especially the root of these sciences. Hermeneutics is the self-clarification of this understanding. It is also the methodology of historiography, though only in its derivative form. So we have these schemas of how these sciences are now going to be developed, right? Everything will be understood at bottom through Lebensphilosophy, philosophy of life, right? And that everything, the way we are the object of the human sciences, and basically the way we are is the root of the sciences. And hermeneutics is the method through which we interpret. Yeah, please.
Didn't he write a book on hermeneutics?
And human understanding.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, before this, before being in time.
Oh yeah, Dilthey's a 19th century thinker and early 20th. Also a teacher of Lukács.
Yeah, but I mean, Heidegger actually wrote something.
Oh yeah, he wrote a book on hermeneutics and
yeah.
understanding. Yes, he did. Yeah, I mean the method is hermeneutics. The question is where do you enter the hermeneutical circle? Where is that decisiveness in terms of history? Where do you cut into? You know, so Chris today is cutting into the human, the hermeneutical circle by a critical moment vis-a-vis whiteness. So you're within that interpretive circle right there, and then the discussion goes around that, and then the question is the temporality, Civil War I, Civil War II with the student. No, anyway, I'm playing, but anyway, yeah. Okay, but you understand this? It's that decisive. Decisive really means to cut into. To be decisive means to cut. Yeah. So you have this cut into the historical moment, that center, right? So are you going to discuss alienation hermeneutically? Where do you begin? Do you begin by saying, it's Grotius is the first to use the term? Do you begin by the etymology? To alienate is used by the Latin being without lien and private and property relations. Do you use it in the Rousseauist sense? Do you use it in all those senses as a background to how do you get to the level of alienation in the modern laborer? And is alienation a necessary characteristic in the proletariat, in its invention? Is it part of the condition of being proletarian and proletarianized? So this is some way that this interpretive science can work, right, in a way, and then how you historicize. I don't know if this kind of opens it up a little bit. So you're really opening up the entry point. It's like surgery, if you will. Where do we operate, right? Where's the operation, right? I don't want to really only just reduce it to medical terminology, but it is kind of like surgery. Where do we cut, right? And what is the time involved in this cut, right, in a way? And how do we interpret around that? Okay. So anyway, he goes on. Hermeneutics is self-characterized. Okay. In contemporaneous discussions, Dilthey's own investigations for the lanes of the foundations, and again, laying of the foundations, which Heidegger tries to do earlier on in his own way, were forced one-sidedly into the field of a theory of science, and it was with a regard for just discussions that his publications were also oriented in this direction. The logic of the human science was by no means central for him, no more than he was striving in his psychology merely to improve the positivistic science of the psychical. Dilthey's friend, Count York, gives unambiguous expression to Dilthey's own most philosophical tendency when he refers to our common interest in understanding historicity. Dilthey's investigations are now only becoming accessible in their complete scope. If we are to make them our own, we need the constancy and concretion of coming to terms with them in principle. This is not the place for a detailed how they motivated him or how they motivated them problems about it. We, however, describe the original way some of York's central ideas by selecting characteristic passages from the letters. So he's going to go on, right, to talk about how York criticizes Dilthey, particularly in the use, if you go down the bottom, at bottom, York is demanding a logic preceding the sciences and guiding them, page 379, the paragraph after the quotes from York, is demanding a logic that precedes the sciences and guiding them as did Platonic and Aristotelian logic, and this demand includes the task of developing both positively and radically the various categorical structures of the being that is nature and the being that is history. York finds that Dilthey's investigations too little emphasize the generic difference between the ontic and the historical. So it goes on more and more. Vindobon, his difference between the ontic and the historical. Right? Okay? So he goes on about Ranke. So listen, I don't want to bore you with all of this because this is an internal German debate about how the historical sciences came to be dominant. Ranke, Dilthey, York's critique. But he's going through this because he wants to talk about historical knowledge, right, as York criticizes Dilthey. If you go to page 381, all written history that is alive and not just depicting life is critique. But historical knowledge is for the best part knowledge of human hidden sources. With history, what creates a spectacle and catches the eye is not the main thing. The nerves are invisible, as is the essential in general. And as it is said that if you were quiet, you would be strong, the variation of this is also true. If you are quiet, you will perceive, that is, understand. And then I enjoy the silent soliloquy and commence with the spirit of history. The spirit did not appear to Faust in his study. You remember Faust is, you know the beginning of Faust? He's translating the Bible, and he's trying to translate, so he puts in the beginning was the word, he crosses out word. And he puts in the beginning was the spirit, he crosses out Geist, spirit. Then he goes in the beginning was the force, he crossed out force. And then he goes in the beginning was the deed, he left the deed. So some Marxists have said in the beginning was praxis, right? And based on Goethe. But this was Goethe in his study, right? The spirit of history. Nor to Master Goethe either. They would not have flinched from it in alarm no matter how serious and compelling the apparition was. For it is brotherly and akin to us, in a sense deeper, and other than the inhabitants of bush and field. These exertions are like Jacob's wrestling, a sure gain for the wrestler himself. This is what matters first of all. York gets his clear insight into the fundamental character of history as virtuality from his knowledge of the characteristics of the being of human existence itself, thus precisely not in the theoretical or the scientific way. Remember, again, Heidegger is trying to think of history pre-theoretical and the pre-scientific realm. History is an a priori, right? Remember this. Again, this attempt is always to go back to the experiential, right? That the whole, the psychophysical datum is not being equal being present in nature, but rather lives in the core of historicity, and its self-reflection is directed not in an abstract ego, but to the fullness of myself. It would find me historically determined, just as physics knows me as cosmically determined. I am history as well as nature. So, the Count was pretty smart, right? And York, who saw through all Faust's relational definitions and groundless relativism, did not hesitate to draw the final conclusion from his insight into the historicity of Dasein. So he goes on, about, York's ability to see history from the standpoint of existence, from the standpoint of Dasein, right? In a way. And this opens up what we would call today the philosophy of subjectivity, right? What we really are doing here vis-a-vis history, the history of subjectivity, and one's own subjectivity as a history, right? As a history. All right. So if we go on to page 383, because I want you to kind of see this, because these are his his both his straw man, but also his prompts, if you will, to go forward. If one has an interest in understanding historicity, one is brought to the task of developing the generic difference between the ontic and the historical. We have thus ascertained the fundamental goal of the philosophy of life. Still, our line of questioning needs a more fundamental radicalization. Page 383, middle of the first paragraph. How else is historicity to be philosophically grasped and categorically conceived in its difference from the ontic than by bringing the ontic as well as the historiographical into a more primordial unity so they can be compared and then distinguished? But that is possible only if we attain the following insights. The question of historicity is an ontological question, not a historical question, but an ontological question about the constitution of being of historical beings. How do we ultimately see ourselves, right? The being of our historical being. The question of the ontic is the ontological question of the constitution of the being of beings, unlike design of what is present in the broadest sense. And the ontic, number 3, is only one area of beings. The idea of being encompasses the ontic and the historiographic. The idea is what must be generically differentiated. So he goes on to non-historical beings, and how do we get to, it's not by chance that York calls non-historical beings simply the ontic. That just reflects the unbroken dominance of the traditional ontology, coming from the ancient question of being, holds fast for the ontological problematic and fundamentally narrows it down. The problem of the difference between the ontic and the historiographical can be worked out as a problem to be investigated only if it has been made sure of its guideline beforehand by clarifying through fundamental ontology the question of the meaning of being in general. So we have to have the meaning of being in general in order to have some kind of sense of authentic history or historiography. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thus, it becomes clear in what sense the preparatory existential and the temporal analytic of design is resolved to cultivate the spirit of Count York in the service of Dilthey's work on the human understanding. So this is where he ends before he goes into the final, section on timeless. Now, again, this question about history is always engaged from the standpoint of, the authentic historicity is the foundations of the 3 kinds of historicity. This is on, again, page 377. I want to emphasize this once again. Right? The three kinds, right, on 377. The present as the moment, right? Interpreted on the basis of the futurely repetitive understanding of a possibility taken up from existence, right? As authentic, monumental, antiquarian historiography is necessarily a critique of the present. So when Foucault says, my archaeology is an archaeology of the present, he is doing a Heideggerian analysis through historicity. Even though I'm studying a 16th century document of René Descartes, 17th century René Descartes in his stove, lit room, right, and heated room, right, in which the dreams come to him and he discovers that he is, not dreaming and is not mad, right? That gives us a reflection on the modern cogito today. You're writing really a history of the present and what is madness today, right? The same thing when you look at the regicide, right? Damien's The Regicide in the beginning of the story of Discipline and Punish. It is not a history of 18th century France and the aspect of regicide, but as the possibility of that threat that is always emergent, right, by people being, quote, exampled, scapegoated, shown to the spectacle, etc. And then how the disciplinary societies proceed from that in the modern sense, even though he's only going to use documentation from the 18th century and 19th century to show something, right? So you're really writing the present by using, right, the past ecstasies, right, and, you know, engaging this or using the monumental and the antiquarian in order to get the present as critique. Yeah. Okay, you understand this in some ways? I mean, this is very Kantian in some ways from the Enlightenment, where Kant says, you know, do we live in an age of enlightenment or do we live in an enlightened age? And Kant concludes we only live in an age of. Not everybody's enlightened in a way. Yeah, yeah. And he's talking about this in terms of freedom is the ability to have public reason, right? Yeah. But critique is always a critique of the present. For a revolution, you have to have a revolution in thinking. Unless you have the revolution in thinking in the present, it's not going to do you any good who's in top and how benevolent the rulers are towards the people, etc. You need the revolution in thinking always as a company. And this has always been a problem, you know, in terms of events. We get excited about certain gains that the left makes, you know, in certain places, but then we forget to think, you know, around you know, the quote, the happening, right? And we forget how to appropriate in a certain way, and then end up, in some ways, being expropriated again by the right. You know, the slogans become incorporated. Black Panther, another great example, the movie The Black Panther, you know, how you take something that's a very powerful code in the 60s. I mean, I grew up during that period. This was a very, you know, I mean, I'm, you know, again, you know, going back in my family, I go in the warehouse, you know, half of the people that were loading sugar in the warehouse were Black Panthers. You know, and I'm you know, in contact all the time with them, as well as studying at Tulane, you know, and reading Black Power and reading, whatever I could get my hands on during that period. And this, to me, was a real, very precious moment, and something that was trying to think in terms of a new world, right? Not only a settling of accounts, but they were thinking through, you know, through models, you know. Breakfasts for, you know, they understood the plight of the black woman in the United States that had nowhere to put her kids during the day and go to work, and then had to go on welfare in order to survive because she couldn't leave the kids at home. Not that she was, quote, lazy welfare queen, you know, which became a type, right, in a sense, right? And they understood this, the daycare centers, the educational apparatuses, right, etc. The right to self-defense, another Second Amendment, you know, that needs to be talked about, you know, I mean, in a sense. You're going to disarm everybody to stop, you know, some shootings. What was this, the 45 days of 28 incidences in schools just in 2018? I think that was the statistic, right? Yeah, the good chance, well, 18 and 45?
So far this year.
18 and 45 days, so once every 3 days.
Sure.
Yeah, okay. That makes
I think
sense.
there's something like.
And they don't have school on Sunday, Saturday, and Sunday. Right, what were you gonna say, Rachel?
Oh no, there was some calendar last year with how many mass shootings per month,
Yeah,
and it was like almost every month it was over 95% of the month.
right.
Not including police
Right,
shootings,
I got you.
obviously.
I got
But
you.
yeah,
Right,
it's America.
right. There's food to eat, as Randy
Exactly.
Raymond said.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't have to run around the jungle.
Yeah.
Scuff up your feet. That was his parody of, you know, the bicentennial and the white Constitution. You know that song? It's a great song. You know it, Sail Away? There's food to eat. Great song.
The jungle and scuff up.
Great irony. If you do this today, you get a social media racist, what, you know, yeah, etc. complete irony, right? You can just drink wine, sing about Jesus all day long.
Oh, yeah.
Gee, it's good
It's
to be
great.
in America. And it goes, sail away into the Charleston Bay, into South Carolina, right? Funny song. But anyway, so look, again, there's a historical component to this in Heidegger's own engagement with the arguments of, how does one found a new science of history, right? How will you do this? The relationship, what he's doing for the first time against Dilthey and, or beyond them, let's just say, trying to transcend and go beyond Dilthey and the good count, is that he's trying to engage this from the standpoint of temporality. That historicality, right, which he'll use historicality, right, as a new term, is both this within timeness, right, and at the same time is always tied to Dasein, right? Always tied to existence. So he has this going on. And it's also methodologically the hermeneutical circle. This is one of the ways you interpret history. So it's a whole new way, if you will, of doing history. And probably the most advanced, Vico's book on history, is the first of the new, the anthropology, the new science, speaks of ages, right? The age of the gods, the age of the myths, and the age of man, right? And
Supposedly the first,
cyclical theories of history. This is not cyclical,
yeah.
Heidegger. This is not a cyclical theory of temporality or of history, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Vigo's was supposedly the first materialistic
Yes.
view of history.
Yes.
According to the Finland Station.
Edmund Wilson.
Edmund Wilson, he opens up with,
Mhm.
begins with a description of Vico, situating the history of materialism and,
Right.
and Marxism.
Marx liked Vico very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, very fond of Vico. Yeah, yeah. His wife was, I think, deaf, and he wrote a textbook, kind of like oriented towards helping her learn, that was used. Yeah, too. He was very, very, yeah. Giambattista Vico. Yeah. Yeah, the new science. Beautifully written text, very poetic. It's a kind of poetics of history. This is another thing that Heidegger, we don't really get in this book as much because he's trying to level, remember, this book is always operative, this text, Heidegger's always operative on multiple levels. And, always the level of the destruction of ontology, right? Yeah. The trying to keep the meaning of the question of being always open. The anti-foundationalist aspect of it, vis-a-vis the human sciences, right? He's always trying to think this through, and the natural sciences, right? And the physical sciences. He's always engaged in this at the same time. And this is, again, the only way you inquire is through Dasein, through existing there, being there, being there. And again, a dismantling of categories in the names of the existentials, right? It's not a question of substance as thought, right? It's a question of undoing substance, right? And showing its, contingency. Yeah? So this is happening throughout, in every chapter, etc. Right? But
So
this,
substance as thought would be Hegel. If I recall.
Hegel, yeah, in some ways, Hegel is looking at from substance to subject, right? Yeah.
Yeah, because I think in the section on Hegel, there, I think he has,
Being in spirit,
yeah,
the
something. like
last
we read
section, yeah, he
last
does,
week.
yeah.
I
He
thought
does.
there was something.
That's a good place to maybe go back to, that the conception of self, right? Yeah. Hegel begins with the conceive the concretization of spirit, page 413. But he's trying to juxtapose from Hegel's phenomenology the existential analytic. Always keep in mind, I think the fundamental part of this book for us that makes a lot of sense is the existential analytic. This is where he's really starting. You're beginning with everydayness, everyday life, right? Everydayness in your Dasein. Again, as I said, to me, the better way of looking at this is a philosophy not only of existence, but really a philosophy of orientation. How does one orient oneself to the world, right? And orientation also in the diagram I did last week in terms of the sun as a governor, right? How does one orient oneself to light, right? How does one orient oneself to the hearing, seeing and hearing? How does one begin to orient oneself in terms of multiple levels of perception? What would that mean? So all of these things are operative in our everyday life, right? And this is always connected to, the thing we don't know, which is we shun it aside, is always the possibility of no longer being, right? Of death, right? Of death and dying. So this is always already there, and what denial this brings in our everyday existence. I mean, we would be such a nation of consumers if we were really in touch with our mortality on a regular basis, right? Wouldn't we want fuller? Don't we still live with some kind of unconscious, quote, hope of something beyond, right? Or something more, right? than the what is, right? And what is there, right? So at the same time, he's trying to lay bare structures, right? Through descriptions of these structures, and get us outside of categorical thinking, So whiteness to him, he would say, come again, right? For him, that would be categorical thinking, right? It would have been a categorical thought, right? In some ways, right? Yeah, it's ontic determinations, right? But I'm saying very important, though. See, that's the thing with Heidegger. You can go back into the ontic and talk about this in terms of the existential. And personally, I think Sartre, in terms of existence preceding essence here, is a much greater way of breaking up these kind of codes, such as whiteness and et cetera. And he was great at writing introductions. Black Orpheus, the introduction to the Wretched of the Earth. All of these interventions he made. Because he understood existence first, right? Outstandingness instead of racial or these kind of determinations, right? And he's very, very important about that, right? Yeah. But you see, in a way of eliminating categorical and bureaucratical thinking, right? Yeah. This is very important. This famous, proposition, existence precedes essence. What that undoes, so much of essentialist tendencies, essentialist thinking, and to Heidegger too. You start talking about whiteness, it's an essential concept. It's the ness, it's a phenomenological concept that is, taking this body, right, etc. Okay, I understand it, but it's still a concept, right, that doesn't really ultimately, show existence, right?
Yeah, sure.
In some ways, or the a priori experiential notion of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So phrases like "leave your white privilege aside" or "you have to do." I mean, this is pretty stupid, at this point, right? I mean, in a lot of ways, it doesn't really have to do with movement of thought and political movement, or any kind of strategic and tactical thinking in either any of these ways. Yeah. Because in some ways you're shortchanging the person with that kind of language.
Of course.
You're shortchanging the culture, right? And really, in some ways, it's an insult to blackness. It's an insult to Fanon to talk about it that way.
Opposite,
Yeah, in some ways.
Mhm.
Yeah. And it's an invention, too. Why not to deal with it as deconstructing the inventedness of it, rather than calling it a privilege as if it has real substance. You're in some ways authorizing it. Anyway, that's just my take on it from the from this position here, right? So Chris isn't here, but he does have a section on fate. Maybe I can just talk to that for a minute, and then we can maybe close up today. 358 is interesting. And this kind of announces the project. I kind of went retrospectively today. If you look at page 358, this is kind of announcing historicity, right? If the question of historicity leads back to those origins, then the place of the problem of history has already then been decided upon. Heidegger is against origins, right? We must not search in historiography as the science of history. Even if the scientific and theoretical kind of treatment of the problem of history does not just aim at an epistemological, knowledgeable problem, ZML, clarification of historiographical comprehension, or the logic of the concept formation of historiographical presentation, Rickard, but is rather oriented towards the objective side, history is still only accessible in this line of questioning as an object of a science. The basic phenomena of history, which is prior to, again, the basic phenomena of history, which is prior to and underlies the possibility of making something thematic by historiographic, is thus irrevocably set aside. How history can become a possible object for historiography can be gathered only from the kind of being of what is historical, from historicity, and its rootedness in temporality. Again, if historicity itself is to be illuminated in terms of temporality, and primordially in terms of authentic temporality, important, then it is essential to this task it can only be carried out by structuring it phenomenologically, which means you're always going to be in the position of suspending your prejudicial judgments towards the historical event, right? The existential, which means that you bring a naive innocence to the object, or what I would like to call a radical innocence to the phenomena, or a radical innocence to the phenomena. So, the existential and ontological constitution of historicity must be mastered in opposition to the vulgar interpretation of the history of design that it covers over. The existential construction of historicity has its definite supports in the vulgar understanding of design and is guided by those existential structures attained so far. So again, like he does with time, he'll get to examine the vulgar concept of history first, right? Before he'll go on to the Zimmel and the Count Yorick. The Delphi and Count Yorick towards the end, right? Okay. Let me just read one other section and then we'll go along. He does talk about stretching along. I like that concept very nicely earlier on, that history is kind of like the stretching along. Page 357 does not first fill up an objectively present path or stretch of life through the phases of its momentary realities, but stretches itself along in such a way that its own being is constituted and beforehand as this stretching along, right? So you're talking about stretches of time and stretching along, right?
So can we link that then to this idea of repetition, the stretching along?
Yeah, you could,
Yeah.
if you want. Yeah, absolutely. You can think of this as kind of like figurative dancing too, in a certain way. Yeah.
I mean, I found that part of this section, I mean, it's in advance of what you were just reading, but on repetition, pretty interesting, actually.
Okay, well, we can go there, not a problem.
It's, 367.
Okay. The more it's mode of resolution?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Resoluteness that returns.
Yeah, exactly.
And is in this section, is he then sort of making the link between Nietzsche's eternal recurrence and then kind of positioning this idea of repetition along those Nietzschean lines, or is it a different kind of concept?
I think it's a different concept in that it's tied more to being towards death.
Mhm.
If you look at the top of 366,
Right.
Design can only be reached by the blows of fate, because in the basis of its being, it is fate in the sense described, existing fatefully in the resoluteness, handing itself down. Design is disclosed as being in the world for the coming of fortunate circumstances and for the cruelty of chance.
Yeah.
Very Machiavellian here, by the way. This is almost like The Prince, the chapter on Fortuna, by the way. Beautiful chapter 25 of The Prince by Machiavelli on the notion of chance and contingency in history. Fate does not first originate with the collision of circumstances and events. This is interesting, right? Not the collision. Even an irresolute person is driven by them, more so than someone who is chosen, and yet he can have no fate. So you need resolution or resoluteness to have fate.
Yeah.
You know?
This is not available to
So you have to
everybody.
be Antigone
Yeah.
or Oedipus the king or Electra, to have this fate, if you want to go back to the Greeks and the tragic age, and the tragic poet age, right?
It's someone who has to be looking for consciousness, essentially.
Not looking for consciousness, it
Or-
kind of befalls you.
Okay.
Yeah. Again, this is not a philosophy of consciousness. It's a philosophy. I mean, you become conscious of it, obviously, and there's an awareness. But at the same time, it's not. You're not looking for the consciousness.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
The consciousness sort of hits you,
Right.
in a certain way.
In the resolution.
And then you have to take it up. Again, to me, this is about not accumulation, not about acquisition, but it's about appropriation. And
Yeah.
appropriation is a real key term here. You take something upon yourself.
Okay.
And if you want to read the dynamic of capitalism and Marxism together, you can actually do the history of appropriation and expropriation. That we must expropriate the expropriators to make what is appropriate to us again. That may be a real, a kind of calling, in a way. And that may be the fate that Marx was really talking about of the quote proletariat. Right? Yeah. In some ways. So let me just go down. So if Dasein, this is I'm glad you brought this up, anticipating, it lets death become powerful in itself, then as free for death, right? So death, we know, is greater than us. Epicurus once said, before death there are no walls. Right? Very nice thing. Yeah. Right? It understands itself in its own higher power of its finite freedom. Here's your possibility again, your higher power, finite. In this way, it takes over the powerlessness of being abandoned to itself in that freedom. We're abandoned to be free in some ways. Sartre uses condemned. Heidegger may be better, abandoned to be free. Might be a nice, I like this. I'm going to have to write this down. I'm sorry. Sometimes, some days I'm okay, Yeah. Anyway. Yeah. So let me go on here. All right. So, which always only is in having chosen the choice, and it becomes clear about the chance elements in the situation disclosed. But if fateful Dasein essentially exists as being in the world, in being with others, then its occurrence is an occurrence with and is determined as destiny. You have no destiny without being with, right? And right? The occurrence and with something.
Because it's not for you, it's for
Right. And it's
everyone.
very much against
Everyone.
the Hegelian notion of the
Yeah.
for itself in itself is
Right.
going on. It's the occurrence with something that is happening or without. Right?
Yeah.
So think of it that way. Yeah. All right, so with this term, we designate the occurrence of the community of a people. Right? Destiny is not composed of individual fates, and this is where Das Mann becomes the Nazi. The Nazi. I mean, this is at least my reading of this, right? Destiny is not composed of individual fates, nor can being with one another be conceived of as the mutual occurrence of several subjects. These fates are already guided beforehand in being with one another in the same world and in the resoluteness for definite possibilities. In communication and in struggle, the power of destiny first becomes free. The fateful destiny of Dasein in and with its generation constitutes the complete, authentic occurrence of Dasein. Fate is the powerless, higher power making itself available for adversities. The power of reticent self-projection, ready for anxiety. And this is interesting, this phrase, ready for anxiety. Nobody wakes up thinking that. You know, I'm ready for anxiety. Right? Or goes to sleep that way either. I never go to sleep. But anyway, as such, like me, I'm afraid of going to sleep because I'm, anyway. As such, fate requires the constitution of being of care, right? That is temporality as the ontological condition of its possibility. Only if death, guilt, we haven't gone through this chapter, but guilt, schuld, and care and conscience are all related, right? Death, conscience, freedom, and finitude live together, equipment primordially in the being of a being, as they do in the ground, as they do in care. Can that being exist in the mode of fate? That is, be historical in the ground of its existence. So you're not a historical actor or a historical agent until this is encountered. Mm. It's interesting. And if you read Gramsci carefully, what is philosophy and the transition from spontaneous philosophy to philosophy of praxis, somebody's saying the same thing. One has not become a part of history until one becomes critically aware of where one is, knowing thyself. The subjectivity is there. It's a very interesting. Heidegger's deeper, if you will, in some ways, as because he's connected it to temporality. But for Gramsci, disjointed, you're fragmented. You're living somewhat unconsciously in the spontaneous philosophy moment. I know you don't know this. I mean, some of you have read this text, but anyway, But interestingly enough, to go on the other side, you're living emptily. You have no full speech. Whereas in the philosophy of praxis, you're moving towards a higher conception of life, i.e. Marxism, right? Is possibility is higher than actuality, obviously, the Kantian, proposition, right? Full speech, right? Yeah, more of an authentic, and your place in history as part of an organic intellectual or thinking beyond the man and the mass, right? Or the mass historical block, you become aware of how that's going to be formed. Mm-hmm. So this is very interesting, all going on. Gramsci's writing Study of Philosophy in prison, 1930, 1927. So you can see there's a kind of, if you will, lack of a better term, material wavelength going on both on left and right about what it means to exist authentically and also at the same time be an actor in history. And for Heidegger, it requires this authentic resoluteness and this encounter with fate. Mm-hmm. Right? Machiavelli, you need both virtù and fortuna. And the problem here at LIU is no one knows anything about virtue. They have a historical opportunity presented to them in terms of a lockout, but you don't know how to work with it because they had no skill. In other words, no real education, even though they're professors. Right? The skill, the virtue, virtuosity, skill, etc., etc. Right? You have to know the bow and the movement of the arrow. The time of it, and this is a very old, a lot of wisdom in the pre-Socratics, and and Zeno's problem of the archery and this thing. Okay, so anyway, this is a fact. So only a being, and this is important again, and I know we've been talking about this, and I'm really glad Josh brought us back to this. We'll go to repetition next. Only a being that is essentially futural in its being, so that it can let itself be thrown upon back upon its factual there, right? Free for its death and shattering itself on it, right? That is only a being that, as futural, is equivalent primordial, having been. I used to be that, right? Of having been that, right? Can hand down to itself its inherited possibility, take over its own thrownness, and can be in the moment for its time. Only authentic temporality, that is at the same time finite, makes something like fate, that is, authentic historicity possible. Okay? So fate equals, obviously, authentic historicity. Right? Yeah. And this is true in the ancients. He is playing on the ancients here, in terms of, one must unfold into one's destiny. Right? Right? And who's the interpreter? Who's the first hermeneutician? Tiresias, the blind soothsayer. You remember Tiresias, the blind man who comes in and reads the tea leaves, reads the fortunes. He tells Oedipus who he is, tells King Creon what's going to happen to him. Tiresias becomes really the first hermeneutical, figure, if you will, in Western literature, in the ancient Greek. Okay? It is not necessarily that resolutionists explicitly know the provenance of the possibilities upon which it projects itself. However, in the temporality of design, and only in it, lies the possibility of explicitly fetching from the traditional understanding of design the existential potentiality of being upon which it projects itself. Resoluteness that returns to itself and hands down then becomes the repetition of a possibility of existence that has been handed down. Repetition is explicitly handing down. That is going back to the possibilities of the design that has been there. The authentic repetition of a possibility of existence that has been, the possibility that the design may choose its hero, is grounded and existentially in anticipatory resoluteness. For in resoluteness, the choice is first chosen that makes one free for the struggle over what is to follow and fidelity to what can be repeated. And here's your idea of the fidelity to the event, fidelity to what is repeated, right? To the repetition, right? Yeah. The handling down of a possibility that has been in repeating, does not, however, disclose the design that has been there in order to actualize it again. The repetition of what is possible neither can't bring back May of '68, what is past, nor does it bind the present back to what is outdated, right? Arising from a resolute self-projection, repetition is not convinced by something past in just letting it come back as what was once real. Rather, and this is important, repetition responds to the possibility of existence that has been there. But responding to this possibility in a resolution is at the same time as a response belonging to the moment, the renunciation of that which is working itself out in today